from coming out on a cold Michigan winter day, but I know most of us are from the Midwest, so this is actually not a bad winter day. This is pretty easy, a couple inches. But we really appreciate you taking time out of your schedules. We know it's valuable time, and we hope after this event's over, you'll feel it's been worth every minute that you've been here. So again, we really appreciate you taking time. And I just wanted to briefly mention, you might be wondering, how did this all come about, this Future of Automotive seminar? And it's been a dialogue that Gary and I, along with our team and our advisory board, have been having for probably 2 years now. And really it is, how can Team One as a Tier 2, Tier 3 supplier survive, thrive, and be successful in this ever-changing automotive landscape? So we brought in 3 industry experts to talk about that very issue. So we're really excited. We really hope that it's not just them presenting, but it's a dialogue throughout the day. So again, we appreciate you coming.
So before we get started, I'd like to say a big thank you to Albion College's president, Maury Ditzler, and his staff who've done such a wonderful job of helping us prepare this great facility for our seminar today. Maury, are you here? He is not. Well, okay, well, tell him thank you. Yeah, that might be it.
You can talk to him about that, too.
And so with that, I'd like to introduce our Master of Ceremonies, Glenn Stevens. Glenn is the Executive Director of the Detroit Regional Chamber's MICHauto. Glenn?
Good morning. I'm not going to run up on stage. If you can see, I've had a little hiking incident. Or as Gary says, I'm getting old. So welcome. So when the team talked about putting this seminar together and who might speak and who might be here, and it's really good to see everybody here, they really exceeded themselves. Some of us go to a lot of industry events. I think a lot of us go to a lot of industry events, but the 3 people that are going to speak today, I've actually had the privilege of seeing them speak in one form or another over the years, and I really believe you're going to get a lot of value add today. When I go to an event or even a social event, I always look at it and say, if you learn one thing or you meet one person that's transformative out of the day, then it's a win. And I'm pretty sure you're going to get more than one thing or meet one person that might be transformative today. So real briefly, what I do is I run the Automotive Association for the state of Michigan. I worked for a long time for OESA, the Original Equipment Suppliers Association. I think many of you know that. And I was in the plastics industry before that. Who knows Blue Water Plastics? I know Kelly does. Okay, so I was VP of sales there for about 4 years. So I know the business a little bit, and it's a pleasure to be here. But what I want to do before we get going is just do a few housekeeping things. First of all, we're going to have Q&A after each speaker. So Laurie Harbour is going to join each speaker for 10 minutes after. You have a password in your program for Wi-Fi. That's another thing, but I want to emphasize that you can vote with the Slido app. I think everyone has that on their program. We encourage you to do that. It's a small enough group so we can do it either way, live or online. And then at the end of the day, we're going to have a panel discussion, so we'll bring everybody back up together. And then again, Laurie will moderate that too. I think that's really basically the housekeeping things. The restrooms are down the hall. I'll come back up before lunch and talk to you a little bit about the lunch. But the team here, and Brenda particularly, put things really well together. Like I mentioned, I go to a lot of events, and to see how this was built and to get all of you in the room today and to get these 3 speakers together it's more than a treat. It's actually going to be really interesting. I personally am going to be taking a lot of notes today. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jeff Schuster. I've known Jeff for a few years, just a couple. But when we look at the industry and people who talk about the forecast and where things are going and where production and sales are going, there's really only a handful of people that are out on the speaking circuit who will be there when you need them to answer questions and who are really thought leaders in this space, and Jeff is one of them. So Jeff, it's all yours.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think just to echo the earlier comments about the weather, I know we're supposed to be hardy, but I'm done with it already, and winter hasn't even started, so I think I'm in for a long run here. Speaking of a long run, I've got a pretty wide view here. I'm going to take us through the current industry, and then we're going to look at what's happening in the near to midterm, and then all the way out to what we call the long autonomous future. Before I do that, just a quick little note about LMC Automotive. Our business development team, who isn't with us, certainly would be upset with me if I didn't share a little bit about us. So we are in the space of market intelligence forecasting. We look at it from a regional as well as a very global view. I'm going to give you some insights on our global take of where the industry is. We have analysts around the world really focused on those local issues to bring the whole world together. So if there's anything we can do to help you, there'll be some contact information at the back of the presentation. So as I said, we'll start with the current industry, look at some electrification trends, and then the long path to autonomous vehicles, which may be an indication of what we think of it. So keep that in mind as we go through the presentation here. To really set the stage, wanted to take a view of what's happening globally. So this is looking at the global marketplace this year relative to last year. So again, a very current view, and I think the key things to point out here, there's a lot going on. The real big issue is the direction. So since January, there has been a pullback overall in most of the regions around the world. You can see the world expectation is for, it's actually just under 1%. It rounds up to 1% increase. It's only 500,000 units. This has really deteriorated from about a 2 million unit increase that we expected at the beginning of the year. So you can do the math there. It's about 1.5 million units out since the beginning of the year. I'll talk about what's going on with trade and how that's impacting the industry overall. But as you can see, as you look around the world, we've got some pullback from the beginning of the year. South America, a little bit weaker, although I think with the election behind the Brazilian market, and we'll see if Argentina hits bottom, it's still an 8% growth rate after a double-digit last year. The real story, I think, is China. So China, we've got down about 1%. Certainly some trade implications going on there with the consumer. There was an expectation the government was going to put in an incentive program in place at the beginning, or excuse me, at the end of the year. They are not. So actually, we'll probably see a revision even further down than the 1%. North America, the key market here, obviously, we've had a slight revision upward since the beginning of the year, primarily in the U.S. market, having to do with increases in fleet volume. But it's still a slight pullback from where we were last year, and I think that deterioration is expected to hold into 2019. Western Europe, relatively flat. I'll talk about what's going on with Brexit. In Central and Eastern Europe, some of that having some sanction impact with Russia pulling the volume down there, but it's still about a 1% growth rate. So from a segmentation standpoint, taking a very broad view, I think the trend that we're seeing here in the region in North America is something that we see globally. So it's a SUV story. SUV is about a 9% growth rate expected this year. That equates to about almost a 35% market share when we look across the region. So that's the global view. It's certainly much stronger here in the U.S. and in North America, but it's a market that's growing really in all regions and all markets, whether it's a mature markets of Japan, Korea, Western Europe, and the U.S. We're also seeing growth in South America. So when you look at the volume increases in South America and look at what's happening in the ASEAN market, in Eastern and Central Europe, the SUV story holds. When you look across where that's coming from, North America, we see it almost entirely out of the car segment. When we look at it relative to the world, though, we see a play really between cars and MPVs and minivans. So there's a much stronger pull from those other segments into the SUV market. The other markets, looking at pickup trucks, so we see growth. It's relatively flat here in the U.S., but globally we see some growth in pickup trucks, only about 2%. We see premiums actually up, globally speaking. In the U.S., premiums are down. Part of that, I think, is the transition from cars to SUVs. But overall, the story is holding around the world as far as where the growth is concentrated. So what are the issues in the short term that we're looking at? Trade is taking a big center stage, and I think geopolitical issues are certainly holding. I put a check mark with USMCA. It's not a done deal yet, but it looks to be a done deal, assuming there's a signature from both Mexico and Canada on that. So I think we'll move on from there. Likely some pricing and certainly some cost issues, whether it transfers over to the consumer and the consumer is impacted from a volume standpoint or a decision standpoint, is yet to be seen, but certainly there will be some cost increases as a result of the new local content rule, as well as the labor rate increase, at least for part of the assembly of vehicles, primarily again targeted at Mexico. Moving over to trade and tariffs, certainly aluminum and steel has had an impact. We've heard what both GM and Ford have talked about, essentially $1 billion hit potentially this year as a result of those tariffs. If we look below that, we still hear the drum beating out of Washington related to imports on parts and vehicles, anything made outside of now what I would argue is the USMCA or the North American region, but I think there's still a lot of risk associated with that. Maybe a little bit less that it's going to happen than it was earlier, but certainly I think as you look at the focus heavily weighted towards China, deals with the EU and Japan still have to get done. South Korea was able to get done, so there's still some major areas of import volume coming into the region here that are under pressure. So just to kind of put in a target around it, if we looked at an EU-focused tariff on vehicles, a 25% tariff, and assuming some of that gets passed on to consumers, maybe some of it gets absorbed, could lower U.S. volume by a couple 100,000 units while that's taking place. So again, a fair amount of risk in a market that's already in a decline or at least a leveling off. Brexit. Brexit getting a lot of attention right now. Theresa May says she has the deal ready for vote. They're now potentially looking at a lack of confidence, so they're trying to rally the party, the Tory party around that right now and could actually push Theresa May out. So I think the tensions are certainly increasing as we come to a head there. We've increased our probability of a hard Brexit, which would really be temperamental primarily on the UK market, but it would have implications elsewhere, to about 40%. So it's pretty equal between a hard and soft Brexit. We'll obviously see how that plays out, but there already is certainly, it looked like a global issue earlier to a Euro issue, and now it appears to be mostly focused on the UK from an implication standpoint. And then, of course, regulation. That's the other big area that we're looking at, globally speaking, and here in North America as well, certainly with the U.S., the midterm review on CAFE, the issue with the California standards, so CARB essentially suing the EPA, the trying to really bring those two standards together into one single standard is really what's at issue here locally. You've got other things going around in other parts of the world, though. You've got the EU looking to really constrain CO2 emissions, but last year actually emissions rose. So that puts the mandate in the midterm out to 2021 under some pressure. China, of course, government is really pushing the NEV vehicles or anything that's plugged in, and so that's battery electric as well as plug-in hybrids, into a 2019 credit. So that's driving certainly a lot of investment and activity in that space. So again, a lot of moving parts here affecting what happens in the near term. Taking a little longer run out to our standard forecast horizon, this is looking at global production. We do see about a 2% growth rate out to 2025. You can see that growth rate, though, isn't equal when we look across parts of the world. So it really is an emerging market story here when we look globally. So Asia, and that would obviously include China, Asia, South America, and even Middle East and Africa are growing at a rate much stronger than the mature areas of Europe and North America. North America expected only about a 1% growth rate when we look back last year to 2025. However, we do see some lifting of that volume, about 1 million unit increase when we look from around 2020, 2021 to 2025. So there is quite a bit of sourcing still coming into the North American market, driving some of that growth. From a utilization standpoint, we continue to put the mature markets, so Western Europe and North America, into the healthy category. It's that magical 80%. North America coming down from from 85, or even in 2016, it was post 90% utilization, which really wasn't a sustainable level. So we see it coming down to a pretty healthy level. You see the investment bringing it down under 80, but holding at 80% through the longer term. In the stable range, we've got Asia Pacific and Eastern and Central Europe really getting up into the mid-70 range there. So again, that's relatively stable and pretty healthy. The risk areas continue to be those emerging markets, Middle East, Africa, South America, right now hovering below 50%, both of those two markets. So a lot of risk associated with sourcing decisions, new investment coming into those regions. They're very underutilized at this point, so that's where the risk is certainly focused. Let's take that and focus a little bit more on what's happening with electrification. This is the big area, I think, in the midterm range here. And really, we look at this from now out to 2030. But to take a look at what's happening in the current environment, this is a snapshot of various markets around the world. You can see the U.S. In the first half of 2018, you're essentially looking at a little over 3%, 3.5% growth rate, or excuse me, market share. And that's split, obviously, a heavier focus on the hybrid and plug-in vehicles that would include plug-ins. The pure range BEVs in the U.S. are under 1%. You see the contrast that around the world. You've got China, that NEV focus that I mentioned earlier, really starting to push the electrification, mainly with BEVs, and we'll see that split out when we put the plug-ins in it as well later. But certainly growing to north of 4% from a market share standpoint. The other big movement that we've seen is in Europe. And Europe has been a story of both plug-ins and full hybridization, including milds. But we're starting to see the full battery electric vehicle edge up. It's only 0.9% now, but we're seeing a lot of model activity starting to drive volume growth there. And that gets you a world that's about 1.5% BEV, and then another 2 almost 3% electrified through hybridization. So it's a market that's in transition right now. A lot of model activity starting to drive that. We've got a comment here, since we didn't put Japan on there, but Japan is still a very different market, mainly driven by hybridization. So you've got almost more than a third of all vehicles right now have an electrification element to them. And again, most of that is through full hybrids and mild hybrids. So if we focus just on battery electric vehicles, this is what the breakdown looks like in 2018. You have a very strong domination in China, with almost 700,000 vehicles are full battery electric. It's, again, that's that government push. A lot of investment coming in from a volume standpoint. You see a big push in the model count here in China, but also focused in driving activity and growth in the U.S. So you see the U.S. and Europe are actually very close right here, essentially at the same point. And this is really the backlog of Tesla starting to drive that volume in the U.S. much higher than it would have been otherwise. So once that's all cleared out, I think we'll get a better indication of where natural demand is. Through back orders are delivered, and I believe that they're talking about making those deliveries now through the end of the year. But nonetheless, I think when you look at total electrification, Europe is starting to really focus on that post-diesel scandal and will pass the U.S., which I'll take a further look at. From a model standpoint, this is what the top 10 models look like. Again, globally speaking, it's a heavy domination of Tesla models. So you've got the three main, the S, X, and Model 3. Model 3 jumps into the third position here. From a global sales standpoint, you've got the new Leaf doing well, but China continues to dominate. So the Beijing EC is the top-selling model, 40,000 units. Again, obviously that's all in China. But we do see continued growth of models in the marketplace here from where we were last year. And that will continue to take place as we look into 2019. There's quite a few introductions coming in Europe, so we'll probably see additional European models enter this space. Long term, this is what the market looks like. Again, looking at the BEV market, so this is taking us from 2017 to 2030. Big growth numbers here, primarily with China and Europe. You see that domination. So China was about a little over 60% of BEV volume in 2017. It falls pretty substantially, but the volume growth is immense. So Volume growth is about 25% CAGR. You've got Europe almost a 30% growth rate out to 2030. The U.S. does finally cross, or we expect it to finally cross the million unit level, but really not until the late 2020s. So speaking of the U.S., this is looking at the volume specific to the U.S. market, and you can see the growth rates. You've got this massive increase in the HEV, the hybrid electric vehicles. Most of that growth to the 2 million unit level is going to be in mild, and this would include 48-volt systems. So a lot of increase dominating there. You see the BEV, obviously, BEV line increasing as well. So a lot of new entries coming in. We'll go from roughly 17 BEV models last year, so well over 120 by the end of this horizon. So again, it's all about that options and model entries that are coming into the marketplace driving that growth. And you've got the plug-ins growing at really a similar pace as well. So pretty substantial increase there. And again, depending on what happens with the emission standards and with CARB, really the plug-in growth is the California initiative driving that. So again, focusing just on battery electric vehicles out to 2025, this is what it looks like. And we've highlighted our view of Tesla. So you've got the massive growth of the Model 3 launch taking place again this year, 2017 into 2018. We've got a continuation of growth with new models coming with Y and pickup potential as well. And then it essentially flattens out. So we think the market is going to really get much more competitive for Tesla. Certainly have proven that they have the right product and the right mix right now. And obviously also proving that consumers are willing to pay for those products from a cost standpoint. We start to see that erode next year as their credits dissipate. So again, it's going to be more expensive to buy a Tesla next year and into 2020. Much more competition coming. So we see their share falling pretty substantially. They're about 70% of BEV sales in 2018, and we see that falling to under 30% by the end of the horizon, and really kind of holding off in that 200,000 unit range. So from a sourcing standpoint of electrified vehicles, this is what it looks like for North America. So we've got a little bit different of a breakdown here I just want to point out. So you've got these are the plug-in electric vehicles. So this would include your full battery electric as well as your plug-in hybrids up in that first area. And then you've got your hybrid vehicles as well as your mild in the second section. So we've got a pretty consistent view out to 2025. A lot of growth from a volume standpoint in both of these areas. But share-wise, it's pretty consistent. A little bit increase in import activity. Again, some of that is the competition coming in where it was previously Tesla dominated. On the hybrid and 48-volt system, you've got a lot of imports coming in primarily from Japan, Europe as well. So that drives that sourcing stronger in the North American region. So it falls from about 60% import to under 30% import. So with that, why don't we take a view at the overall long-term picture. And just to kind of set the stage, we certainly follow the SAE standards in this. When we looked at autonomous vehicles, what we're going to focus on is really level 4 and level 5. So that is essentially the fully autonomous or highly autonomous vehicles in certain circumstances where drivers are not needed. And that's level 4, and then level 5 being basically no driver needed in any circumstance or any road condition. I think to set this, what I wanted to do is focus a little bit on kind of where things were a year ago and where they are today. If we look at the Gartner hype curve or the hype cycle, and look at where autonomous vehicles are last year, they were really past peak. So essentially the hype of AVs, from our standpoint, really peaked out last year. If we fast forward into this year, so the curve this year, we see a separation of level 4 and level 5. So level 4 is actually well past peak and starting to get into the trough of disillusionment. And I think the separation then of level 5 has been pushed way back. So I think this is a real change in the marketplace and starting to look at those two technologies differently. And the deployment of level 4 is certainly taking place now and starting to expand as we look at city centers and some of the testing going on in many parts of the world. but level 5 is certainly much further out than I think previously anticipated. So from our standpoint, when we look at what needs to be solved in this space, these are the areas that we focus on, and this list is not exhaustive. It's meant to really show the 5 main areas that we focus on: the vehicle itself, some of the external issues, obviously the consumer, the human factor, the framework around litigation, legalities, insurance, privacy laws, and then obviously the commercial impact and vehicle cost and infrastructure is a big issue as well. Some of these areas, legacy vehicles, there's expected to be 1.2 billion vehicles on the road globally, and those vehicles are either going to need to interact with AVs or get off the road really for high penetration of AVs on a global basis. So a lot of issues, even something, and it sounds silly, but AV bullying, and this is a consumer messing with an AV by either jumping out or throwing something in front of it to try to trip it up. These things are happening, and certainly as there's more of them out there, it will continue to happen. So let's look a little bit further in some of the issues. So this is looking at probably not too different than some of the roads that we might have to deal with here, hopefully not on the way back towards the Detroit area. But you know, on the left here, you've got obviously a road that's completely snow covered. Where is the road? So AVs are going to need to be able to deal with that. They can't right now. You've got another situation here. We have a few potholes, I think, in Michigan. So you've got potholes filled with water. It looks like a flat surface. These probably aren't the monster potholes that'll swallow a car. We have those, and if that's full of water, it's going to look like a road, and it isn't a road. So you could have a lot of damage to the result of this. So these are things that the AV needs to deal with just from a seeing standpoint that I think certainly isn't quite there yet. Some of the other issues, and these were tested, all of these were misclassified by the deep learning systems. So you've got angle problems with signs, again, trying to read how the signs are impacting traffic and intersections. You've got graffiti issues, if there are graffiti on the signs, the context of where is that turn taking place, or just issues with again distortions on the sign itself. All of these things tripped up the systems. They will get there. There's no question in my mind that, but these are causing some delays, I think, in the overall deployment of the system. This is actually from a video, and it's hard to see here, but let me describe what's taking place. You've got two individuals talking well off of the road, and this is a Waymo AV that sat and is sitting at that intersection there making a turn, and waited a full 15 seconds to try to figure out what those two individuals are going to do. Are they going to cross the road? Are they sitting there? Are they going to jump out in front of me? Are they going to throw something? So again, it from a safety standpoint, I think in testing that's what you want the vehicle to do, but it also suggests that we're not quite there yet. You can't have a vehicle just sitting and waiting 15 seconds before completing a turn when there's really nothing in front of it. So I think some of the other areas going on, anyone been to New York recently, you've dealt with congestion, I think, in Manhattan, caused by certainly the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. So the sharing vehicle model is certainly causing some issues, and I think that service in the impact of that, whether it's the full congestion or the fact that it really is adding to the total miles driven, is certainly something that's under fire and will continue to be in various areas. So whether it's sharing models not being allowed in cities or being blocked from expansion, and that's really what's taking place here, where the mayor of New York is essentially halting new Lyft and Uber rides. So again, it's an issue that needs to be solved. The integration between this, the scooters that have invaded cities around the world, including Detroit, the impact of that and how that's all playing into the sharing in the transportation model is certainly something that I think is also going to be taking a toll on the overall deployment here. Speaking of deployment, we're looking for a very slow rollout, and really one that's focused. If you look at these systems, these are really targeted at moving people from places like airports or city centers, again, to other places to either get them to their regular vehicles, or to get into another public transportation system. So around the world, all of these areas, we see a lot of focus on the first and last mile. Again, the Rotterdam has really been in deployment for quite a few years, and that's having a further expansion with the To Get There group. So I'm not negative on AVs. LMC is not negative on AVs. We just think it's further out. So all of this is going to happen for all the good reasons that we think AVs are there. Safety obviously is a big area. Looking at the shared model and kind of that integration with existing transportation systems certainly will help with congestion, but if we look at what's taking place today in cities through this transition period, there's going to be some growing pains associated with that. Looking at obviously vehicles being used more effectively for the cost of them, the parking situation, certainly getting people that aren't able to have transportation or be mobile today to allow them to be mobile. All of these are really helping to expand the technology and create more services. So just a couple of slides here on our overall view. We really put a split between shared AVs and owned AVs. So from a forecast standpoint, when we look at this, this is what our scenarios are looking like. We did this earlier this year. We're going through a revision of this now, and what I will tell you is we're probably pulling these numbers down even further. Our central forecast, though, is looking for it's about a 25% growth rate from 2030 to 2050, under 70 million units total globally by then. We've got it split between three scenarios. We call it constrained, our central view, and then a breakthrough. And you've got a pretty wide range. You've got about a 4 to 10 million unit range in 2030. And then globally speaking, the range widens up to around between 40 million and 90 million vehicles globally speaking. So again, quite a wide range, a wide band of uncertainty on deployment, but certainly going to be different around the world. When we look at the split here between shared and owned, you've got a high concentration and growth of shared through China, through Europe. Obviously, you see the growth in the U.S. as well, but it's certainly more pronounced in China. On the owned side, you would expect that to flip, and it does. Much less owned AVs in China. You see a big push in Europe with, again, the premium brands and premium market driving growth in North America here as well. Tying it all together, this is what it looks like. So the line on the top here would represent what our forecast was before AVs. So you're looking roughly 140 million units out to 2050. The impact then of AVs, so you've got the level 3s falling off, you've got the shared and owned coming on, where shared represent about 60 to 65% of AV population out to 2050. It's about a 9 to 10% pullback in overall top line volume. So that's kind of what we're looking at from an overall forecast standpoint. I'll leave this with you. Generally speaking, though, real quickly, the short-term picture is favorable, but has deteriorated somewhat with risk. The U.S. is in a good position, and sourcing coming back into the North American region will help. AVs are much further out. And with that, I'm happy to take some Q&A. Thank you very much.
How many of you know Laurie? Raise your hands. Not many. Well, about a third. So if you don't know Laurie, I would encourage you to get to know Laurie at a break or at lunch. Laurie has a long experience in a lot of different areas, and again, like Jeff, there aren't a lot of people where I say they know more about the supply chain than anybody, and Laurie's one of those people. So, and I don't get paid to say that, although I might want to. But Laurie, you want to come up and do some Q&A with Jeff? Thanks.
So the first question I want to tackle is, you talked a little bit about the 232 automotive tariffs on parts and vehicles. What do you think will be sort of the extended effects of that? And ultimately, I know you talked about 150 to 200,000 units, but there's a lot going on about the forecast, and will the forecast go below 16 million? Can you talk a little bit about that out sort of 19 and 20?
Yeah, of course. So we obviously look at this in a scenario environment because there's a lot of moving pieces, and I think it's very fluid as far as how this ends. But generally speaking, I think when we look at the near-term horizon, we've got in the local market, we've got a really strong economy right now, likely to pull back a little bit next year.
You've got an environment of rising interest rates. You've got used car substitution. All of these, these factors in some cases are balancing each other out. And then you throw the trade and tariff risk on top of that, and it does create an environment that is certainly difficult to predict. That being said, I think assuming we don't get any massive change in the structure or implications from new tariffs, we're looking at a slowing of auto volumes. So in the U.S. Next year, 2019, we're looking about 16.9 million, 17 million, so a couple 100,000 units. We do have it by 2020. There's a little more risk, I think, of a slower economy 2020, 2021. So we're kind of in the, what I would say, high 16s, 16.5, 16.7 range is kind of what we're looking at now. And obviously that spills over to the production side. I think production overall has been managed pretty well from an inventory standpoint. So inventory is in good shape, mostly around the market. We had the transition from cars to trucks, and that was a bit painful, but I think the market's over that now. So I think generally speaking, we're in still pretty stable environment. There's risk, but it's pretty stable.
Do you have a feeling that the administration will pass this tariff, or what is your thought? Do you think it's, I realize that nobody's crystal ball is really clear, but.
It changes by the tweet, I think. But, I think it's very difficult. I don't think we're going to see them, but it really just comes down to it's all negotiation right now. So I think that's been made very clear that regardless of the short-term pain and the what side of the fence you stand on, this is a negotiation tactic, and if it gets people to the table and gets the deals done, the industry will move on. If it lingers, I think that's when we start to get into some problems. Right now, our base case forecast would not expect that, but that certainly is a risk.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about autonomous level. Of course, Waymo had this recent announcement of a full-scale rollout in terms of level 4. So is that getting closer from your perspective?
I think level 4 is, which I think when you looked at the the hype cycle, that I think was really a tell here that the industry was looking at autonomous vehicles previously of kind of rolling those two together. I think you've got a very different, and over the last couple of years, we've seen this ebb and flow where you've had a lot of different strategies, some focused on moving up through the levels. You had announcements of skipping all the levels and going just to level 5. And I think the industry is starting to really come back from these different views. And while the development and the technology and the R&D is still pouring into level 5, I think you've got a convergence of level 3 and 4. So we're going to continue to see further deployment of level 3 and some of the safety implications there, the advancements. But I think level 4 is really the focal point now. So I think, the deployment of level 4 is realistic. It's not going to be there for everyone in every situation, but I think we'll certainly see more of that in this, the standard horizon that I mentioned, like out to 2025. The numbers, in our view, will not be there. They're going to be a rounding error still, but we will start to see them and have them on the roads more than the test markets they're in now.
Okay. As it relates to EVs, of course, there's a lot of new models being launched in the next, couple of years, up to 2025 and beyond. Where do you see EVs in terms of their domination of powertrain in the future? Is there going to be more of a balance between EVs and the ICE engine, or where do you see that, and when do you see it?
Yeah, if you look far enough out, we definitely believe that. I think when you look at the full spectrum of EVs, in the market here in the U.S., if you go out to 2030, we're still only about 20% electrified from our forecast. If you extrapolate that out to 2050, then you're getting into a space where ICs at some point may become only available with a hybrid system on them. So you may not see an IC only by 2050. So that's, those are the things that we're modeling right now. looking much further out. I think that in Europe is much more of a realistic view. It might lag here in North America, but I think that's the prospect that we're looking at. So not quite balanced in this, transition period, but we're going to see pretty strong exponential growth of EVs.
Okay. So you talked about the sedan market. We all know that sedans are sort of really dropping and CUVs and SUVs are launching. So as you look forward, are we going to kind of hit the bottom of that market? And if so, or even with the current drop, who's most affected among the OEMs in North America?
Yeah, I think we're starting to get towards that. I don't think it's going to be a slow trickle, I guess, is a better way to put it, as opposed to completely reaching bottom, I think, of the sedan market. So we do see sedans continuing to be an important market. It's roughly still 4 million units a year here in the U.S., so it's still a viable market. I think one of the interesting things that happened recently, and that is Toyota, who initially said we're committed to this market, they're starting to change their view a little bit and said that they're looking at maybe deploying more SUVs and maybe cutting back on sedans. So I think we're going to continue to see that. It's a transition that's taking place, but we're going to get to the point of saturation in SUVs. I mean, you're essentially there now. You've got a lot of products still rolling out, but you've got pretty much any size, price, off-road, on-road, variation that you want right now. So I think growth is going to slow in that, which means growth out of sedans is also going to slow. So we're not quite at the bottom though.
Okay. So last question, and then we can ask more during the panel. But you have suppliers here, right? So you've got both tier 1 and tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. Can you talk a little bit about what you shared this morning? What's the impact on them? What should they be thinking about in the next 3 years, 5 years as they plan their business?
Yeah, I think the biggest impact or the biggest view is with all of this competitive pressure, whether you look at it of the transition from sedans to SUVs or out of certain body types to SUVs, you've got the EV coming in as another competitive component. You've got other manufacturers that aren't here yet that will probably be here, and then obviously the Chinese is a big element there. That's all dependent on trade and getting things sorted out. But I would say with all the competitive pressure and things being fluid, the biggest thing is be flexible and understand your customer and know the market and where they're going. Because I think the struggle is there's going to be volume pressure down at the model and program level. And I think to maybe diversify and get into areas that you're not in now. Don't rely on one customer. It's diversification. Obviously, it goes without saying, but I think it's going to get even more intense. We've been moving down this path of a competitive situation, but we're getting competition from a lot of different areas. And I think one of the things that the industry is looking at now, and you look at that with the GM cost-cutting decisions that they're talking about, that's going to affect programs in this near to midterm horizon, and they're trying to pay for AV development because AVs, and I think this is another sign that maybe it is going to be a longer road. There's no return on that right now.
Right.
It's all a giant money-sucking sound. So I think that's going to be a key test: is how do you invest in the future and still keep your current operation viable?
Okay. We're going to talk more about that restructuring stuff in the panel. So join me in thanking Jeff for speaking.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break. Before we do that, I want to do an exercise that somebody did at a meeting I was at yesterday at General Motors. It was about the same size group. How many people here drive a pure EV? We've got one, okay. How many drive some form of hybrid?
Oof.
Wow.
How many drive, I know where this is going, a truck or an SUV? Right, there you go, break time. As I mentioned earlier, Jeff kind of brings it to the reality of today and gave us a look by the numbers and actually some food for thought. We were just talking a little bit at the break. My favorite business book is Only the Paranoid Survive by Andy Grove. Has anybody read that? So Andy Grove was the founder and chairman of Intel, and I love this book. he talks about inflection points. And when you have an inflection point, you do one of two things. You either take the upward trajectory and you change your business or your team or your life, whatever it is, or you take the downward trajectory. Things don't stay the same. And I think many times in our industry, and you can look at particularly some of the OEMs, they've wanted things to stay the same. I think if you look at General Motors, what they're doing right now, great column by Daniel Howes in the Detroit News today, they're looking at the headwinds. They know they have to change their employee mix for what they need to develop, and they are trying to take the upward trajectory. So the fact is you may debate when things are going to change or when new products are going to come to market, but the fact is they're going to. And to put a little context on that and to give you his thoughts, I'd like to thank Jeff for coming. And his bio is in there, but I think that you're going to get some real food for thought that's going to come at you pretty hard and fast right now. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. I generally stay away from stages. True story, I lived in China for 3 years. When I was there, I gave quite a few presentations to universities because we were hiring like crazy, like everybody in China. So there was one time I was speaking at a university on a stage that looked exactly like that. And I was giving a presentation in Chinese, which if you've ever tried to speak Chinese, it takes a fair bit of thought to put the words together. So I'm thinking about what I want to say and then translating it in Chinese and saying it. I fell off the stage twice, which was about that high. I mean, it didn't hurt myself, but it was like, excuse me. So as you'll see in the next 30 minutes, I generally tend to wave my arms a lot. I walk around a lot, so I'm just going to stay down here. Sorry, camera guys, if you have to readjust your direction. So wanted to talk about future mobility. My bio's in there. A couple things. I've been in the automotive space, interior space, for my entire career, 25 years, hired in January '94. I've had 25 evals in those 25 years. In every single one of those evals, it says you talk too fast. I still get asked to speak, and until I stop getting asked to speak, I will continue to speak too fast. So if you don't like fast talkers, sorry. I'm going to give you a 60-minute presentation in 30 minutes. I started working at Prince Corporation in 1994. For those who know Prince Corporation, founded by Ed Prince. I bring that up mainly because it's fundamental to who I am. And I think somewhat instructive to who, as an industry, we need to be. I don't know if people know, anybody heard of Prince, and does that name even mean anything to people? Yeah, a quarter maybe. So Ed Prince was a guy who was running, he was building die-cast equipment for magnesium, these really large things, nothing to do with automotive. But he had a buddy at his church who came to him one day who worked at a company down the street called Donnelly. Don't know if you guys have heard of Donnelly, doesn't matter. They do exterior glass type stuff. And he said, Ed, I got this idea. I talked to my boss about it. I'm so sick and tired of driving to church late because my wife is, this is like in the 60s, right? My wife is putting on her makeup and we can't go until she's done. I think it'd be cool to put a mirror on the underside of the visor and she could put her makeup on the way to church and I could be on time. And Ed was like, well, that seems kind of interesting. What'd your boss say? My boss said that was the dumbest freaking thing he'd ever heard of. And Ed Prince said, well, geez, that seems kind of cool to me. So the two of them made a prototype, drove over to GM in Flint, made a Cadillac presentation, and Cadillac said, oh, we'll try it. They gave him an order to make 5,000 visors, which they did. That was I don't even know what, 70 something. I hired in, like I said, in 1994. When I hired in, we were making 5,000 visors an hour. One plant. Ed Prince ended up passing away, wonderful man. His wife ended up selling the business. What did he sell the business for? $1.35 billion. He was a guy that was making die-cast equipment, and 20 years later, his wife cashed a check for $1.3 billion. Why? Because he was committed, and his team that he assembled was committed to going in and saying, well, why not? I don't know why there wasn't a mirror on the back of a visor, because nobody thought of it. The people who were making visors before Ed Prince came along assumed that their cheap $2 visor was going to be the best thing ever, forever. And they don't have a business anymore. That's fundamental to my understanding of business and kind of how I ended up getting bought by JCI. 2 years ago, got bought by YF. At the end of the day, we're still the same people thinking about interiors all the time. So, future of mobility. I saved 60 seconds because Jeff already did this. Identify your terms. We already know what all the different levels of autonomy are. I like to show this because this is about a year old. This came from a Boston consulting study that they had done. 25% of miles driven by 2030. This is where I should have probably prefaced this. This is the Jeff, anti-Jeff presentation. This is the Jerry Springer show. He might be right, I might be right. We won't know for a fair number of years, but we disagree. I've seen Jeff speak a bunch of times, I love him. I just have a different view on what the inflection point looks like moving forward. When we look at what happens in 2030, we think 25% of miles driven in a city, let's be clear, it's not what happens out in, pick a city you want to pick on, Brighton. Adrian, we can pick on Adrian. Is that going to be the big city of Adrian? Maybe not. But in big cities across the world, that number is too low. Level 4 SOP by 2021. There's revisionist history that always happens in our understanding of the current based on what we thought 2 years ago. So like I said, this is a year ago. If you talk to the Boston Consulting Group, they'd say, well, we never actually said that. No, they actually published this, so you kind of get to hold their feet to the fire. Waymo has level 4 autonomous vehicles on the road today. It's 2018. So a year ago, they were wrong by 3 years. Huh. Oops. Electrification, that's a tough one to argue. I'm not going to worry about it too much. Acronym standpoint, don't get caught up on the SEAV. That's a kind of a European acronym for shared electric autonomous vehicles. In the US, we quite often say CASE or ACES, Autonomous Connected Electric Shared. At the end of the day, it's an electric car that's being shared and being managed by a mobility service provider. I think someone mentioned this was going to be a slide in this next presentation as well, so I won't dwell on this. But this is what inflection looks like. True story, you can go on, this isn't my stuff, you can go online, you can get these pictures yourself. 1900, you got one guy driving a car. 13 years later, you got one guy driving a horse. What the heck happened? Well, the industry got disrupted. To me, that's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing to think about is all of those carriages that are on the left-hand side were built by somebody. All of those cars on the right side were built by somebody else. Well, why'd that happen? How hard is it to take a carriage and take the horse out and put this engine in, and now I've got a horseless carriage? You would think every single person on the left would have been the guy or the gal or the company making the car on the right. Somebody argued with me that maybe there was one that kind of survived for a few years. Whatever. At the end of the day, nobody-ish made the transition. And the reason is that argument of disruption. What do I need to do to make that change? And this is true of the OEMs, this is true of Tier 1s, YF, Global Interior, Tier 1, it's true of you guys if you're Tier 2, if you're Tier 3. How do I make sure that I run my business today? Because I can't go all in on tomorrow and not worry about today, or else I'm out of business today. I need to be in business today to be able to support the business tomorrow. This is hard. And I don't make fun of this like those guys on the left were dumb. If you read, Clay Christensen, if people are book readers, I probably should have had that in my introduction. I had the misfortune of getting an engineering degree and then wanted to do some other stuff, so I got a philosophy degree, which means I end up reading too much. It also means I've got personality issues. If you could read one book, Clay Christensen is something that everybody needs to read. So The Innovator's Dilemma, the whole idea of how industries go through disruption. And the reality is that every industry that's ever been disrupted has had this problem. This isn't unique to mobility or transportation. And the reason why this is so difficult is that the decisions that you need to make today to make sure your business is optimized for today will prevent you from going to the right. So if you've got the best, smartest management team in the world, you won't make the transition. Uh-oh, because we got a really smart management team in our company. You can all say. What you need is the ability to say, hey, how can I still make business today while having an eye to the future? And I'm going to maybe make some decisions today that are bad for my business today so that I can be on the picture on the right. I can say with some confidence, I was going to say authority, but that's too strong of a term, some confidence that if Daimler, 30 years from now, makes as many cars in 30 years as they make today, they are going to throw a huge party. And you're like, well, Daimler, they're big, right? They're going to be fine. Daimler is afraid they don't make it to the right picture. And it's nothing special about Daimler. So is BMW, so is VW, so is Ford, so is GM. Every single automaker is afraid they won't make it to the right picture. Which we can have that lunchtime discussion of, why did GM just lay off 18,000 people or offer letters, blah, blah, blah. It's because of this picture. Mary Barra wants to get to the right side of the picture. GM is posting record profits and firing people. That doesn't make any sense. Mary, you read the book. In order to make the transition from left to right, I got to do things that maybe are dumb today that let me position myself to get to tomorrow. And maybe the future business disrupts the present business in the end. If you know Delphi was kind of going out of business. What did they do? Started a new company. That they're hoping that new company runs their old company out of business. Well, that's not how we normally do things. Well, that's what you do when you think my current business might go out of business. Yeah, we'll save that comment for later. So 60 seconds on Wi-Fi. I put this in here because I just like self-disparaging comments. We came up with this vision a couple years ago, Better Life on Board, through our superior automotive technology, interior solutions. I hated this when it came out. And I hated it because I worked for a Chinese company and I thought, doggone it. We let the Chinese come up with our vision statement. They don't have good enough English to know we don't get on board cars. We get on board trucks, we get on board trains, we get on board ships. We don't get on board cars. And then a year later, you realize, son of a gun, they nailed it. That is the right vision. And I've seen plenty of other companies start to, I don't know if we were first, but we were pretty close to being first to use a ridiculous verb, how you get into a car. And now just about everybody's starting to use that verb because we're not thinking about a car as a car anymore. We're starting to think of a car as mobility. Well, what's the difference between a car and a truck and a train and a boat and a ship? Nothing. It's a way of getting from here to there. Well, you get on board stuff, especially if you don't own it. So suddenly this is insightful and visionary and crap. Shouldn't have complained about it. So what do we do? The last 30 seconds of what we do. This is our kind of personal Wi-Fi disruption. We have to run our today's business. We do the stuff on the inside of the car, instrument panels, door panels, floor consoles, et cetera. We've got to be able to do that efficiently, low cost, lightweight, all the stuff. In that next year, the year after that, this is what keeps us in business. It's what puts food on my table. And frankly, when I say bad things about Daimler, I love those guys because they are literally feeding my family. They pay us, my company pays me, I get to feed my family. That's all this stuff. And in the short term, we're hoping to move into kind of this stuff. This is kind of the 0 to 5 year. How do you do stuff? And this is, I would say, instructive to the other folks in this room who are in similar businesses, just probably smaller. How do you do stuff that's tangential to what you do today? So we don't currently do real wood and aluminum, but hey, we probably should. We don't typically do a ton of electronic stuff, but we probably should. This is definitely a trend that's coming near term. Autonomous, not autonomous, doesn't matter. The electrification of plastic. When I get in my car, every surface is going to be a display and a control, haptic feedback, capacitive, blah, 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 whatever technology ends up winning. Everything, the door, the IP, the floor console, the roof, if I can see it, it's going to become a display and a control surface. Well, if that's the case, what am I doing? What is our company doing to make sure that we've got products that enable this? And then into kind of the final new mobility customers, which is really fundamental to this conversation, and it'll be in the slide coming up here, of, well, who are these people? It's interesting or instructive or important to recognize that the new mobility customers are generally all consumer product, consumer service data companies. Let's pick on Waymo. We'll just go to the next slide. There's questions about, well, who's doing what? Again, all of my presentation, you can say, I don't know that I agree with that slide. All right. It's mostly opinion-based. You're welcome to disagree with every single slide up here. This is a fact, but in general, I don't think anybody in the industry would disagree. GM might argue a little bit. Waymo's winning. Waymo has way more miles driven on the road. They have way more miles driven with electronic CAE type models, et cetera. Their technology is ahead of everybody else. GM is by far closest in second in terms of, this is just the graph of California miles, but it really replicates every other place where they do testing. Waymo's in the lead. Why is Waymo wanting to get into the car business? Do they want to make cars? They think it's sexy to weld and paint, and they don't care about the car. And again, I do work with different customers, so I always have to be careful of whatever I say is nothing special to me. You could realize the same thing if you just think about it for a little bit. Waymo isn't going to build a car. They're going to buy a car. They're doing it today with Chrysler. Waymo maybe won't even provide the service. I'm not sure. That's an interesting curiosity whether they'll be the app. Is it a Waymo app that calls the car? Maybe it's somebody else that they contract to do that. What does Waymo care about? Waymo cares about eyeballs. How much is eyeball data worth? There's been a lot of studies on this. The most, it seems like it kind of centers around, from the different ones that I've seen, around 60 cents a mile. 60 cents a mile? What's the government reimbursement rate when you drive somewhere and it's 55 cents a mile? What you just told me was that the data was worth more than the car. Yep. Uh-oh. And this is where I would say I disagree with Jeff, and it's the last slide of my presentation, so I'll just hint at it before we get there. We have a tendency to create linear trajectories based on what's happening today. And linear trajectories work all the time, except when they don't, in that disruptive world. This being a caveat, I like to throw this in every presentation I give. Finance people, when they talk about disruption, or a recession is kind of their world of disruption, they are right for 17 of the last 3 recessions. Well, if I say it's going to happen often enough, sooner or later I'm going to be right. So that's the tough thing about disruption. Very few people can predict it with 100% certainty, and you know that is going to be a disruption. But with Waymo, if the world gets disrupted in this way, they have the opportunity to monetize the data and provide enough value for themselves without the car. So if that was true, you could imagine a world where Waymo can offer the car ride for free. I don't swear a lot, but oh shit. What does that change? Well, that changes a lot of things unless everybody else can figure out how to monetize the data the same way, and then we have a competition. Can Ford monetize data as well as Waymo? Uh-oh. Honda was in partnership with Waymo. I don't know if you knew that. They were going to sell some cars to Waymo, and then they pulled out, and they said, we're not going to do this with Waymo, we're going to do it with GM. Why did Honda pull out of a relationship with Waymo? I don't know. You guys don't know. I can bet that there was a table where they sat around and they said, hey, Waymo, this is great. You guys are leading the technology. We're going to do this thing together. And then, when we get this data and you guys can use it for your stuff and we can use it for our stuff. And Waymo said, what? I'm sorry, that last bit. That we own the data? No, we is the we. You are going to build a car for me. Uh-oh. Is Honda ready to be tier 2? And GM and Ford and Chrysler and BMW, VW, every single automaker, are they ready to be I think Chrysler is probably the closest, right? Chrysler has kind of said, yeah, this autonomous thing, whatever. Let us know who wins and we'll just build a car for them. It's not a bad strategy. So this is the end of our slide. That was my 60 seconds. That went 4 minutes. What are some data points that are out there? Europe versus the US has some really interesting things. Europe is more of a government-led initiative where they're saying, hey, we want to have less cars in city centers. You can see the different ones. Madrid just passed a new law, passed a new initiative within the last 6 months. Essentially all of these, Oslo, banning either parking or driving in the car. The government is coming and saying, we don't want that. We're going to carve out this space. The US is very different culturally. No surprise there. We have been a generally technology-led activity. Waymo has gone to the government and said, who's going to get out of my way? And Arizona governor raised his hand and said, me, pick me. I will get out of your way. Everybody went to Arizona because Arizona basically said, you can do whatever you want. Just tell us when you're done. That isn't what Europe is doing. So it'll be an interesting test to see which is better, to have a government-sponsored initiative that says, hey, don't do this here, or a government laissez-faire, hey guys, you go do your thing and we'll see who won. But this is it's happening. This is just our little graphic to understand this is a European city. This is how we think it's going to play out in Europe. You'll have this urban center. People can still own cars. They can drive to the outside of the city, but they won't be allowed to drive inside the city. You'll either have to take public transportation or you'll have to have a city-sponsored electric vehicle, Uber-ish type ride. And that's how you're going to get through the city. There'll be no parking. There'll be no personal cars that are allowed to drive into the city. There'll be a firewall around the city. This is kind of a vision of what that looks like. It's got to have a Wi-Fi banner getting pulled by a plane, which I love. Very important to the future. But as you can tell, lots of green space. That used to be a big parking ramp. Nope, now it's green space. People getting in and out of cars, public transportation, bikes. But it's a pedestrian-focused city. And the main reason I bring that up is that in the end, autonomous vehicles, this is another, if I was to have a slide, which I don't, of autonomous owned vehicles versus rideshare autonomous vehicles, I don't know what the ratio would be, but it would be a lot to very, very, very little. The value proposition for you to go buy a $100,000 autonomous vehicle, which is just like a $20,000 vehicle, except it drives itself, why would I do that? If I'm a business and I can buy 100,000 autonomous vehicles and deploy them, well, that investment is just part of the business case that I'm just looking to get a return on. We see autonomous shared being a huge market trend based on city direction, municipal government direction, or individual, hey, Google's offering me a ride for free. It's not gonna be I wanna put that car in my garage. Safety, this is one that gets argued about all the time. But it's fascinating to me, just again, revisionist history. I was at a conference in 2000 where the chief designer from Fiat was given a presentation about what the world would look like in 2050. The reason why he was doing that, because he said, I'll be dead by then, you can't hold me accountable for this, which I appreciate the honesty. But he said very clearly, by 2050, we will not allow people to drive cars. Because it's unconscionable what we do with cars today. Which is just, this is about 6 months old. How many people, it's been pretty flat, it goes up 1%, down 2%. How many people die in the US every year? 40,000-ish people every year. You gotta just step back and go, if we had 40,000 people die in plane crashes every year, people would lose their stuff. You wouldn't catch me dead getting into a plane. Are you kidding me? Cars? I get it, there's a chance. But we drive a lot of miles, so death per mile is pretty low. It's 40,000 people every year die. If autonomous can bring that to half that, this is where government is going to get involved and say, okay, I love the fact you guys love to drive, but you're not very good at it, honestly. And some of the autonomous level 3 stuff does get people better. I can get distracted, and it keeps me in my lane, so I can text now while I drive. Still a horrible idea, by the way. That was a joke. You shouldn't text even though you have lane departure. But this is going to drive a lot of behavior where the government... A story. You guys heard about the story where Uber had the gal get killed, the guy who was sitting behind the wheel? That was last 4 months ago, something like that. How long was that in the news? I think it was about 24 hours. Might have been 2 days, I don't know. I'm not a big conspiracy theorist. I think it's kind of funny when people talk about stuff. But it is curious to see when things like that happen. It's like, man, woman killed by autonomous vehicle. That didn't go away on its own, right? That went away because people wanted that to go away. Because that story gets in the way of this fact. My opinion, again. The government and technology and some industries want this to happen for making money if you're Waymo, or saving lives if you're the government, that will create pressures that will get us off of a linear trajectory of what we think the future is going to be based on what it is today. So who's going to do this? Today, these are, if you want to call a car, you got Uber, Lyft, Drive Now, etc. In 2030, who's going to do this? Maybe the same people, but maybe not. Maybe it's the city of Boston who offers City of Boston rideshare. They buy the cars, they operate it, they would outsource it, but they would be responsible for transportation inside the city. That's KVB, RATP, just Transport for London. It's kind of a European example. But municipalities, Facebook, Booking, Amazon, are they going to get in on mobility? If the data is valuable, the people who can monetize the data are going to want in on this game. Those people monetize data. People who can't monetize data can't play this game. GM is trying like crazy to figure out how to monetize data, which I find kind of entertaining because they had OnStar a gazillion years ago. They had the groundwork to monetize data. They never did because they didn't know how to do it, because in order to monetize data, you got to think like a technology company, not like a car company. The people who win are the people who realize that they're a technology provider, an information provider, and not maker of car. Maker of car becomes it's a little important, but not that important. So what does this look like? We're interior guys. We don't really care about the outside of the car, which as a side topic for that, we think nobody's going to care about the outside of the car. If you call a car today, I don't know if you guys ever use Uber, you call an Uber. Who else uses Uber in their life? That's not bad. There's other places in the world where everybody would laugh at you for asking the question, by the way. The fact that you hadn't used an Uber makes you I can't think of a socially appropriate word that they would say. In the end, when you call an Uber and it says, well, Jose's going to come with a Toyota Camry, you don't go, Toyota Camry, I rode in that last time. Ford Focus, maybe I could ride in a Ford Focus. You never do that. You say, whatever. Jose's 2 minutes away. Jose it is. Toyota Camry looks like it's going to be. In the future, when this happens, you probably will want to choose class level more than you do today, because there'll be cheap options and expensive options. But you're not going to care about what the outside of the car looks like. It's not going to come up to the curb and be like, yeah, woo, that's mine. Check it out, y'all. Because today, when I buy a car, it says something about who I am. I drive a Mercedes, by the way. Company car. There's no way I'd ever buy that if it wasn't a company car. But that says something to people about how important I am and how rideshare or car, whatever. So what if you're in the headlight business? Hella, Valio, there's other people in the headlight business. Those guys are scared to death. What does a headlight look like on a car that shows up to pick me up? It probably needs to be like a flashlight to let pedestrians know I'm there. But the super LCD $100 headlight, that's gone. It's not gone. They will still sell niche vehicles that go to racetracks and have really sweet headlights. Mass production, the sweet headlight is a thing of the past. That'll show up in a museum. You won't have that in the future. What we believe you will have is when that door opens and you're like, all right, now I'm getting into my car, depending on if I'm just going around the corner, if I'm spending an hour in it, or if I'm taking my wife to the opera, depending on the use case, I will call a car that does what I need it to do. I'm going to go pick up some stuff from Home Depot. I'm going to call the Home Depot car. So there's all kinds of opportunities for what happens here, which is kind of cool. The danger, run out of time. The danger is that if I'm Hella and I'm a headlight company, go back to that disruption curve, I know someone's moving my cheese if you ever read that book. My world's changing. I got to figure something out. As an interior supplier, and I would say as an injection molder, you could say, whatever. That other stuff is going to change, but my world's not going to change. As soon as you get comfortable, you're screwed. So we're concerned about what the future interior looks like, but we know there's going to be one, and we know people are going to care about it. That's good and bad. It's good in the sense that we have a future. It's bad if we think, so therefore we don't need to do anything. So we're doing stuff. A couple of images real quick. IKEA. You know things are changing when IKEA says, well, this is the car we'd want. This is the car IKEA wants. That being said, I had a conversation with some senior executives at YF, which was just a fascinating conversation. Hopefully this isn't inappropriate, where we were talking about competitors. And in the interior world, I deal with Drexelmeyer and Forrest and IAC and all these Grupo Magna. And that executive team was like, we don't care about any of those people. What do you mean you don't care about that? Every day we're fighting it out, trying to beat those guys. It's like, it doesn't matter. 20 years from now, we're going to be competing with supplier X, Y, and Z. And I won't tell you who X, Y, and Z were, but none of them make interiors today. So they know who they're afraid of. Not today. Today we're just going to keep slugging it out. But tomorrow it's not going to be the same people. A couple of other images I don't have time to go through in detail. I love this one because it's got a tree in it. But to be clear on this one, I find this one to be hauntingly compelling. This was drawn by a 20-year-old kid from CCS, Center for Creative Studies in Detroit. This is his vision of what he wants to take to work every day. Well, you could say, well, he's stupid, but he's the future. And the fact that you're 48 like me, and I think, well, I wouldn't ride in that, doesn't matter, because they're not going to build cars for me 20 years from now. They're going to build cars for him 20 years from now, and that's the car he wants. So I have to pay attention to the fact that there's a tree in his picture, because he wants a tree in his car. Are we going to get into the tree? I slipped this in real quick. I don't have the time to talk through each of these. If you're a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, what does this mean for? It means a lot to everything. If this, strike that, when this happens, and there's arguments whether it's 2030 or 2040, but there's very little argument about the if, it's just the when at this point, it changes everything. So if you're wondering what should I be thinking about in my business, you can go down this list and be like, Well, if there's no cars that people own anymore, then there's no garages. If there's no garages, people are going to want to decorate their garage. They're not going to tear the building down. What are we going to do? You can go in that space and figure out what you can do. And I'm going to end just because I took the time to build it. This will be my last comment, another personal story. When I was in college, we did a study looking at pendulum curves, and it was intended to be a trick study. I don't know how many people got engineering or math degrees, but this will be your engineering and math lesson for the day. If you take a pendulum and you measure the arc angle of that pendulum as it swings versus the height of how high it is, and you measure that at very small increments of radians, it turns out that sine of theta equals theta. Sine of 0.1 equals 0.1, sine of 0.2 equals 0.2, sine of 0.3 equals 0.3, sine of 0.5 equals 0.5. Clearly, pendulum height versus arc angle is a linear relationship. Well, no, it's not, you idiot. A sine wave, it goes up and then it comes down. And so the sine of 3.14, is 0. So sine of theta does not equal theta. We live in this world. We live in this projection of what the future looks like based on what I saw yesterday, what I see today, what I see next year. This is kind of the future. It isn't a linear relationship, especially in a time of disruption. And that'll be my last comment. Thanks, everyone.
You're going to have to come up on stage for a minute.
I can sit on a chair. Right?
That was great, thank you. So there's actually a ton of questions, as you can imagine. So you talked a lot about autonomous vehicles and your opinion of when those will be. Can you talk a little bit more about when do you think we'll see them in the masses? You know, I know we say 2030, 2040, but from your personal opinion and perspective and what you're doing at YF, where do you think we'll start to really see them in the masses?
So 2 comments to that. Number 1, I think Southeast Michigan is going through its own disruption right now. When I talk to colleagues at other companies that are in the automotive space, there's a fair number of them that are, and I apologize for this, they're flat earthers in terms of this is the way it is, it's never going to change. It's never going to happen. And then there's a fair number of people in the MEDC, in Planet M, in MICHauto, Glenn, that recognize this is coming. And not only is it coming, but Detroit needs to change its mindset away from, hey, let's just make a really quality car. That's important, you got to live today. But when does that change come? Boy, they're starting to realize that it's coming. How soon does it be given, kind of mass introduced? Detroit's not first. That's part of the problem. When I go around Detroit and it's like, well, you know, where are all those autonomous cars you're talking about? I don't even see that many Uber or Lyft cars. Go to a lot of other cities, whether it's China or Europe or plenty in the US as well, they're already doing a lot of this stuff where it's just kind of normal and natural to have that stuff. So the fact that Waymo has already bought 80,000 cars, they didn't buy 80,000 cars to park them. I don't know if you realize that or not. They got a lot of money, but they don't have that much money. They are outfitting 80,000 cars to put them on the road. That will happen in the next 12 to 24 months. They will start deploying them now. They already are now. But they'll have all 80,000 on the road in the next 24 months. They will all be level 5 capable. I don't know when they take the guy out of the passenger seat. Hard to say. But we will see those cars more and more outside of Detroit. Snow, ice, potholes. We're not the place to do it. Phoenix, Atlanta, San Francisco, Miami. That's where you're going to see these cars showing up. And you're going to see them in 2019, 2020. My opinion is that by the time you get to 2030, it will feel like kind of an iPhone-ish conversation that says, well, yeah, we've been doing this forever. No, we've only been doing this for 10 years. And we will be at that level of kind of normal acceptance.
Okay. So from that perspective then, which OEMs you think are best positioned globally to be the leaders in this front of the traditional OEMs? Mm-hmm.
Clearly, GM has made the biggest play. They've invested in Cruise. Now they're losing all kinds of money with Cruise. Again, from a Mary Barra making money today, Cruise is the worst thing she ever could have done. But it's the best chance she has of making it to the right picture. I would say GM is clearly in the lead. There's a lot of Chinese companies that have the opportunity to make this transition because they're not that old, frankly. Mm-hmm. So it's not that big of a deal to make this transition. I think the ones that are in the biggest danger are BMW VW, all the German makers, and if there's any Germans in the crowd, the thing that will help them is that their entire nation is dependent on car making, and so their entire government will rally around, hey guys, we can't let this happen this fast, so they'll try to slow it down. But they are the furthest behind with the belief that they will just keep making high quality cars and people will buy them.
Okay. So as you take this perspective of AV, what do you think this does to volume in the future? If you look out to 2030, what do you think volume's doing in North America?
I don't think I disagree too much with Jeff's chart that the autonomous depresses. I think our outlook is that it actually does more damage than what was shown in the graph. We believe that the autonomous penetration leads to higher levels of a reduction in volume, which is interesting relative to maybe what affects you guys, which I apologize, I'm not able to see people through the computer screen. One of the initiatives that we have at YF, and I'm guessing other people have as well, if you look just today at the total number of volume of cars being built and the number of platforms being offered this year and next year and the year after that, the volume is relatively flat. Jeff showed the graphs, but the number of platforms is going up 30, 40, 50%. Well, it's pretty simple math. It's flat volume, 50% more vehicles that are being made to make that volume. The number of cars per, the volume per car, per platform is gonna go way down. So we love making the F-150 because man, you could just, all day long, you're just printing money. What happens when your total volume of a platform is 10,000 and your next program is 10,000 and your next program is 10,000? The industry is gonna have to learn how to make money in small scale manufacturing. And right now we have no idea how to do that.
That's a great point. I was gonna ask about when you, as a major tier 1 supplier, what has to change for you? Because obviously we've seen this high mix and low volume happen for several years now. What does it mean for you, not just from a manufacturing standpoint, but obviously the alignment to some of these sort of new OEMs and what that looks like, and then what does it mean to the tier 1, the tier 2, the tier 3 suppliers that support you?
So a couple of items. Number one, new mobility customers universally don't like you to talk about them. Not sure why that is. Number two, none of them view themselves as car makers. They view themselves as electronics producers that the electronic thing they're making is a car. And they all have an idea of minimal viable product. I don't know if that acronym means anything to you, MVP. What they're saying is, we don't do all of our development, testing, PPAP, we're now ready to sell a car. They make a car that's good enough and they sell it. And then the next day they make a better car. And the next day they make a better car. And so the whole idea that we're at rev whatever, or we're gonna do a mid-cycle enhancement, that word means nothing to them. Mid-cycle, they do a mid-cycle enhancement every day. Well, how do you manage your business if you're changing continuously? When we put together a launch team for a new mobility customer, that launch team never goes away. That's dumb. But you've launched it, it's in production. Now just let the normal production team handle it from here. Nope. Every day you're making engineering changes, you're making tooling changes, you are changing stuff and making it better every day. Well, that's kind of a big deal. That changes our business model pretty dramatically. The other thing, a couple things just out there. Today, why don't we recycle interiors in a car? In general, you get end of life, it goes to a junkyard, the junkyard takes out the bits that are worth something, and then they send it to, there's a place not too far from here that runs it through a shredder, and you have ASR, automotive shredder residue, you put that in a bundle and you put it in the landfill. Why don't we take the interior out and reuse it? Well, it's not economical because you'd have to have a deal with every single junkyard in the country and figure out how to have them send it to you. Well, what if just a handful of companies were mobility service providers that owned all of these cars? And at the end of its useful life, they would send you the interior back to you. Oh, I can recycle the entire interior for the most part. Some foam bits I'd have to still throw away, but for the most part, I can grind up and reuse all that stuff. So there's a green story here as well that's linked to a mobility service provider providing the service. And the last one I would say from a further out there, if Waymo is running this service, we'll just keep picking on them, there will be plenty of others obviously, they don't want to have to deal with, oh crap, the interior's dirty. Somebody spilled their coffee. That's just a pain in their neck. Is that a business model for YF? Is it a business model for one of you guys to start your own business? I don't know. Where you say, I will manage through detection when that car is no longer fit for service. So someone calls and they go, oh, nope, somebody just filled their coffee, and the car knows and knows where to go, knows how to get itself fixed, replaced, functional, whatever, then goes back in service. That maintenance model, that subscription maintenance model, will be a business for somebody.
Wow, that's an interesting concept. So last question, as you look at the traditional OEMs today, will they then just be a service building cars like Chrysler is to Waymo in the future? Based on your idea around the left and the right side, do you think, in your opinion, obviously, is it all GM and Ford and Chrysler building cars for Waymo and Lyft and Amazon and everybody else?
So there was a woman who's the CEO of a company called NIO. They changed their name to Next EV. Padme Warrior is her name. She came out of, I think, Oracle or something like that to be the CEO of this company. I was having a conversation with her 2 years ago, and she made the statement, yeah, Jeff, you do realize that every automaker you can name right now is going to be out of business in 20 years. And I laughed. It's like, going on. There's a lot of car makers. We make almost 100 million cars. I'm not going to say that's dumb because you're way smarter than I am, but it sounded kind of dumb. And we got into this conversation, and you realize that she believed it. She wasn't being funny. And the longer I soak in this, again, I go back to this is a painful thing for me to say. I have fed my family my entire life because of automakers. I don't know if they make it. I don't know if GM makes it. GM has the best chance, but you can imagine a future reality where the mobility service provider says, hey, I just need somebody to make me an electric sled, a Foxconn, people talk about this all the time, just Foxconn the car, we'll create a cool interior for it, and I don't have to worry about all that brand. Toyota's connection to the consumer, Waymo doesn't care about Toyota's connection to the consumer. They just need a car. Who's gonna make the most cost-efficient canvas of a vehicle that Waymo can outfit and leverage? Is it going to be Toyota? Maybe. I kind of doubt it. To me, it's only a question of when those people either get so dramatically downsized that they aren't recognizable anymore, but you still have the name Daimler, or your kids or your kids' kids go, I'm sorry, Daimler? What were they? Which is a weird dystopian future, right? Because all of you are sitting there going, you're full of crack, man, there's no way. And I hope I am, because I like those people. I work with them every day. But as I look at the trajectory, I'm scared to death for those guys. And when I talk to them, they're scared to death, honestly.
It's an interesting concept. There's a lot of things we can talk about that our kids don't have a clue right. What we're talking about, like a phone on the wall or something. All right, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Okay, after that, the bar is open. No. So a couple quick things. So I had the privilege to ride in the Waymo vehicle in April. I spent the day out in Mountain View with them. Level 5 for a half hour all through the streets of Mountain View. A quite amazing experience. The thing that was really kind of strange is I was trying to figure out why is this so jerky and halting? Because it was coming to a complete stop at every stop sign. Guess I don't do that so well.
All right, so thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. So, as I was watching our version of the Jerry Springer show this morning, it confirms to me that our industry is in a period of very intense transformation. And so during this transformation, there's billions of dollars being spent, big bets being placed. And it's being done by OEMs, it's being done by tiers, it's being done by software companies. And so what does that mean to a tier 2, 3 supplier like us? We're typically our customers are anywhere from hundreds of times bigger than us to thousands of times bigger than us. So what is all of this, as we look at this landscape and look at this transformation, what does that look like from the perspective of a plastics automotive component supplier? Okay? I think that pretty much sums it up from our perspective. And in that whole picture, where do we fit? Okay, so that's us. We're the flea hanging on for dear life. So what's a flea to do? So over the last few years, as we've been going through our strategic planning and we're looking out 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, we had to decide, well, how does this all affect us? What kinds of things should we be doing? And one of the conclusions was, well, we need to keep doing the things that we've always been doing as a company. We need to innovate in our narrow area of expertise. We need to contain our costs, reduce our costs. We need to do continuous improvement. But one of the bigger points that comes out of this is that we need to sort of understand our customers better, and we need to understand how they're reacting to all of this. So we really need to assess our customers. So we have to look at, from where we're at, does it look like they're towards the front of the pack? Are they leading it? Are they big enough? Are they strong enough? And are they agile enough to push their way through all of the obstacles that are going to undoubtedly be put in their way? Also, we're going to need to do these same kinds of things to our suppliers. The other thing we have to make sure of is, well, what about the ones that are back at the watering hole wondering where all the other elephants are? So at the end of the day, these are the kinds of things that we see as a small supplier in this big ecosystem that we're going to have to make sure we take care of. So I want to hand it over to Craig so he can talk a little more specifically about some things that we see, some very specific ways that we think it will impact our business.
Thanks, Gary. So we've heard a lot of different things about electrification and autonomous, and how do we fit into that? And really, as we see electrification, it's a threat. It's a threat because we make a lot of parts for internal combustion engines. And if you look at how many parts are on a battery or electric motor kind of vehicles, and how many parts are on an internal combustion engine, it's an order of magnitude different. And so even if we have some parts on batteries, it's just going to be a smaller piece of a pie, especially as everyone's acknowledged it's happening, and it will happen over time. In terms of autonomous, again, there's going to be whole systems that don't exist in the autonomous world. Now, we're happy to be what we consider a great partnership with Yanfeng and Wi-Fi, because as they talked about, they do interiors. So you can argue all the different changes and all the different systems, but there's still going to be an interior. And in some of those models, I would argue, plastic will play a bigger and bigger role. So we have a role, but again, some of our other customers make oil filters. Maybe not as many oil filters will be made. So even autonomous affects us, what we're doing. As Gary said, really, it's all about our customers. We are that small flea on a tail, and it's really going to be what kind of customers do we pick? So these are some of the questions we're asking today and in the future. Do they have that vision for the future? Are they at least asking the questions? We've heard there's some that are thinking it's not going to change. Boy, we don't want them as a long-term customer. So do they have it? Are they a leader? Especially in technology, most of what we're hearing about today, whether it's electrification or autonomous, has to do with technology, data, all those things that we've heard about. And for us, and this has always been in a business like ours, you don't want excessive concentration in any one of our customers and any one OEM. Because as we saw during the recession, GM and Chrysler went through a bankruptcy. We now even question whether they're going to make it the next 10 or 20 years. You don't want to be hooked to one of those, or in particular to one of our tier one customers. And vehicles. We are competing in the USMCA. It was so much better when it was NAFTA. USMCA or something now, but I guess you just say USMCA region. Again, our tier level, we compete in that region. Good news is that region has a lot of production there, and it will remain here, but we need to know that's where our competitive is, and in particular Mexico. As we know, that's been a growing region, and as a plastic supplier, 25% of our parts are going down into Mexico. Do I believe it will be 25% 50% in 5 years? Doubtful. That supply base is being built up, so how do you replace that with other business? And an important part when we look at our customers is what's their footprint. We don't want them just in Mexico. Hopefully they have some operations in all 3 of those countries. And we've heard today SUV and trucks, at least in this region, is going to dominate. Sedans will still play a role, but you need to know, and I think both Jeff mentioned it, what mix you're on. What vehicles are you on? What are they selling? Because sedans have been off for the last several years, and looks like they might continue to be hopefully flattening. So again, we need to assess where we're at. And so one of the things, and that's why we're here together today, is educating ourselves. We feel like to be the right partner for our customers, but it's not just customers, as Gary said, we have suppliers here too. It's a partnership, and we've talked about you need to have good partners. No one's going to do this alone, and you need to make sure you're aligning yourself. We've had 3 excellent speakers, and they're all thought leaders, and I think with Daron you'll see they all have differing opinions. That's exactly what we wanted. If we had 3 speakers say the same thing, then we only needed 1 of them. And so each of them getting us thinking in a different way, and we all need that. And finally, we want to continue these discussions with our customers who are here and some that didn't make it, to continue this kind of conversation of not where you're at next year, not what you're at 3 years, how are you addressing these seismic shifts in our industry, and how can we help you be a partner. So thank you. And Glenn, I'll turn it over to you to continue with the program.
Okay, thanks, guys. So whenever I come out here and visit their plant, I like to do it because it keeps me grounded on really what drives the industry. So there's 17 OEMs in Southeast Michigan now, with headquarters or R&D centers, the 17th being GAC Motors, a Chinese company. There's 96 of the top 100 suppliers in North America are in Michigan now, YF being one of them. But there's almost 2,000 Team 1 plastics in Michigan. And they're of all different shapes and sizes, but that's really the backbone of the supply chain. So I'm glad we're here today doing this. So let's keep this look at the future and present going. I'd like to introduce Daron Gifford from Plante Moran. The thing that I've known Daron for a long time too, and consider him to be one of the best thought leaders out there too, but Plante Moran as a company has really been committed to the plastic space for a long time. And some of you know their leaders, both current and retired, that have done that, Daron now. So the stage is yours, Daron. Thanks.
Thanks, Glenn.
Can't multitask.
My topic is the future of mobility. We call this disruptive technologies create new realities. Maybe a quick background on myself before we launch into that. So, as Glenn said, we've known each other for many years. Actually, I've known Jeff for many years, known Laurie for many years. Haven't met Jeff Stout before, so we'll get to know each other. I started actually in the auto industry with one of the big OEMs, the biggest at that point, General Motors, back in the 70s. So it's been over 40 years now in the auto industry. Worked in the industry, worked in manufacturing on the shop floor. Worked with other parts of GM back in those days. Were aerospace as well as automotive. And then I've been in consulting now for over 30 years. And so at Plante Moran, I lead our strategy consulting group across all industries, and I lead our automotive industry consulting group. And so the research team and our folks in that area report up into me. And we undertook this task going back a few years ago when I was consulting with the Department of Energy on some of the electric technologies. And so we had the chance at that point to work with some of the big names like a Tesla that were out there. So we actually had many meetings with Elon and his team back in the days when Elon would say he was homeless in those days. I don't think he's homeless today, except when he's living in his tent outside trying to get the Model 3 production up. But also with, and with Nissan and the Leaf, but also with some that were kind of duds, like the Fisker. If any were suppliers to Fisker on the Karma, it's trying to resurrect itself now, as well as probably 100 other different suppliers and OEMs, startups, a lot of them, that were trying to take advantage of some of the money that was available. This is going back 10 years ago in the middle of the crisis that the Department of Energy had. So the germination for the kind of this whole idea of projecting the future really started with that. And it's evolved now into what I'd like to talk about today, which is a projection or forecast model that we have around this idea of autonomous and mobility and sharing and electric and manufacturing, how these all converge together. And a lot of this information is going to be very consistent with what you've heard already. We have some differing views, as Craig mentioned, and so it'll be interesting to get in that discussion as well. So with that, I'm going to launch into the presentation. We'll go through some of this fairly quickly. I think the presentation will be available for people as well, and I'm open to, we can talk about that during the Q&A as well as afterwards. Quickly about Plante Moran, many of you know who we are, but the quick debrief is that we've been around for 94 years, so going back to 1924. It's accounting, tax, as well as consulting, as well as some other services around real estate and site selection and investment banking and wealth management and a number of other areas. We have over 3,000 people in Plante Moran now, and we've expanded. We're primarily in the Midwest. We're now expanding westward with the addition of another firm just a few weeks ago, headquartered in Denver, but the offices are all over the place out there, and heavily into more the energy space. We also have a worldwide network as well as our offices in Monterey and Shanghai and Mumbai and in Tokyo. And I'm in the strategy area, as I mentioned, I lead the strategy consulting group, and my main focus is also probably with the automotive group and automotive suppliers especially. And I'd say a big chunk of our consulting clients are automotive suppliers, just like yourselves out there. Many of you are our clients already. So this picture Jeff showed earlier too. So it's a bit of a repeat. The context, we usually like to do this presentation. We've done it probably almost 20 times in the last 6 months for groups like this, but also individually with our clients. So I would say that that's been very helpful to get your management teams together in many cases and have this brainstorming session for an hour or two. And it's a good way to kick off a strategy session, frankly, as a way of trying to get everybody thinking a little differently. And not everybody agrees, but the key part about starting off, especially with a slide like this, is disruptive change. And this was 118 years ago, right? That's the point Jeff was making earlier. Easter morning in New York City, and look for the automobile, and there's one, and it's all horse and buggy. And then only 13 years later, almost to the day, Easter morning, he found I could never find that horse in there. So you can barely see him. It's all cars. So industry gone, not gone, but it's just a lot smaller. Completely new environment out here with cars, with streets now instead of dirt roads. The guy who scoops up the manure on the streets is probably out of business. It's an unfortunate casualty maybe, but he probably got a lot better job after that. Let's hope so anyway. But that's the kind of disruption that I believe we're facing. And after being in the industry over 40 years, it's amazing to me when some people say that I don't believe it's going to happen. So to me, it's not, the technology is already out there. It's already available and it works. It's a matter of when. When do we think it will occur? And that's really what our attempt at trying to forecast the future is all about. What are the drivers to make the when happen? And then from your standpoint, thinking about what do you have to do to make sure that you're ready when it happens? What do you need to do to get your company positioned to take advantage of that in the future, similar to what YF was talking about earlier. So we build it around these 4 major drivers, starting with autonomy actually, because we think that each of these enables the next layer for a disruptive change to occur. So the idea of an autonomous or self-driving vehicle, we think, is absolutely crucial to making mobility and sharing actually occur in any kind of volume. Because the single biggest challenge to sharing, which we were talking about at lunch as well, is access to the vehicle. So if I have to walk 2 miles to get to the vehicle, or I have to get a ride to get there, like we do with rental cars today, then it's a disincentive. Now some people say, oh, well, no, what about Uber? Uber will come pick you up. And that is true. And that's where Uber and Lyft and these companies have made a tremendous business model. However, it's an expensive business model. If you look at it on a cost per mile, you're paying for a chauffeur to drive you around is what you're doing. And our people have looked at this and really drilled down into what drives our transportation behavior. And cost per mile is one of the single biggest things that affects us, even if we don't think about cost per mile all the time. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But access to the vehicle, autonomy enables access to that vehicle anywhere that you want to be. With a self-driving vehicle to come get you, take you where you want to go, drop you off, Another one can come get you later, if you think about it conceptually like that. Likewise, the idea of autonomous and sharing, we think actually really helps accelerate electric. Because there's a lot of electrification already, but it's on the slow uptake. It's that linear line right now. It's not really taking off at this point in time. And one of the challenges, frankly, is not only the cost, which is high, but also the life of the batteries, the range of the battery that the electric vehicle can take you. Those factors, we think with autonomous and shared actually are really disappear for the most part. Because if, for example, if I'm driving out here to Albion today, which I came in from the southeast Michigan area, if my battery were to get low, or maybe if it's low right now, it drops me off, I get another car and keep going. Okay, it's a matter of making sure the swap gets scheduled sufficiently. Probably I do need to get out of the vehicle once in a while too. There's certain biological things that have to happen out there. But the idea of electric, if the battery gets low as well, if it drops me off, then it should go off and self-drive and then park and then charge. And it'll be able to recharge itself. We'll have a fleet of these autonomous shared vehicles potentially out in the future that can take us around. So it sounds a bit science fiction-like, but we think that's a huge enabler to making electric really happen in a high volume way, beyond what all the efforts that are going into it at this point in time. Beyond government controls, by the way. The last part we think, though, that really just provide a huge opportunity for a group like this, because we're very optimistic about the future, if you didn't pick that up already, for the automotive industry. We are not naysayers at all, but we think the supplier has a huge role in this in the future. The manufacturing of the vehicle, we think, will change dramatically. As you talk about changing the architecture of the vehicles, what the requirements are of the vehicle, and who's going to spend the money to develop these vehicles, we think yourselves if you're positioned correctly, can really take advantage of this and really become a critical player in this manufacturing of the vehicle in the future, because somebody still has to make the stuff. So even though some people think that all the OEMs will be out of business in 20 years, that's great, but somebody's still got to go out and make 100 million vehicles globally, right, to make it work. Even if it's half that much, they still got to make them. We think it's going to be more, actually. So this you've already aware of. So we go through this to educate the client sometimes, because everybody's not real clear about the level of autonomy. I think that's been talked about here, but this, when we talk about self-driving and autonomous, the Tesla, the autopilot's really more like a 2.5 in here. I think the Cadillac Super Cruise is like a 2.5, somewhere in that range. So nobody's really, this is all in the test phases out here, as far as fully autonomous vehicles that drive around by themselves. And time-wise, we think that's going to continue for a while in more of a testing environment. So in this view, this is one that's been developed by others in the past as well, as far as these different phases and this idea of geofencing. But it's similar to what Jeff was talking about, setting up this area where you can actually build, you can test the autonomous vehicles and see how they work. As we sit here today, it's really interesting when people kind of say, well, where is this happening? There's over 100 different locations in this country right now that are doing this. And there's over 20, I think there's about 20 in Michigan alone. Now they're small, they're not real big. Someone was talking about it at lunch in Detroit. Quicken Loans has got their own version of this going on. It's a very short route, slow speed, but they have a need to move thousands of young employees around that don't necessarily, there's no place for them to park, for one thing, to get around there. But that's, we think over the next 2, 3, maybe a few more years, a lot of this kind of testing is going to go on. We'll get smarter about it so that we don't run into people and kill them, hopefully. I mean, that's an unfortunate thing that happens with some of this, because in some cases it wasn't maybe as controlled or disciplined as what it should be. But then we think it'll grow. And similar to that picture that Jeff was showing, this is a picture of New York City and the boroughs of New York City, and how you could grow a small geographic area, geofence it, slowly as you get more confidence, trust, the liabilities are all put in place, you can expand it. And we believe that that's where the model for autonomous will end up growing. It'll start in the urban areas, because that's where the need is the most, and it'll slowly grow out. And the only question is there really a limit in the future? If you go out to 2030 and beyond, this is the whole United States. Is there going to be a limit to that in the future? We're not sure. However, I would argue that maybe not so much of a limit. Maybe if you're on a farm way out in the country somewhere, the need for it may decline. At the same time, I would say that farmer, for example, from an agricultural equipment standpoint, would like to have an autonomous tractor that runs around in the fields so he can go do something else. So there's a lot of interesting evolutions of this that can occur. So we'll move a little quicker through here. This is, in the model itself, what we put together is this is today's version of transportation, where you drive it yourself, or you rent it, or you use a taxi, or you take a bus in some cases. And in the model, we've categorized this into 3 different types of transportation. One being there's one that's still privately owned still. It's not shared. This group here would probably make above average incomes in here. We still want to own our own vehicle, but it will have autonomous capabilities. And in fact, there'll probably be requirements, as we geofence these areas, that it goes into an autonomous mode at certain points. So we're not allowed to actually make a mistake ourselves, and the computer shouldn't make that kind of mistake. It may stop abruptly all the time, Glenn, like that, because it's not going to go over 55 if it's 55 miles an hour. But I'm sure somebody will figure out, some enterprising young mechanic is going to figure out a way to break into the system so you can actually crank the speed up if you want to, but not legally. But we also think that the big part of this will become this personal pool taxi idea, the sharing of vehicles going around. And I would also venture to guess, these are pictures here of the Waymo, the Pacifica van, the Waymo Google car, the little one. But the evolution of the architecture of these vehicles, I think, will also change very dramatically, because in some cases, the sharing may not mean we have to ride with 3 other people. The sharing just may mean that the vehicle picks me up and I want to be by myself because I'm going to be on a conference call, or I just want to be by myself, and it'll take me somewhere. And that model is the one we're in today, because most of us drive ourselves. We don't really share the ride into work. And we don't want to. Sometimes it's because it takes time, but sometimes I can't find anybody I like to go with. But that also drives, from a consumer standpoint, then if we start doing more of that, I would argue that maybe the architectures of the vehicles change quite dramatically, because now we're back to the Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report. Maybe I only need a single passenger vehicle. And it only needs to be this wide in that case, right? So now you have a different set of lanes infrastructure-wise, and it's my own shared autonomous vehicle, but it drops me off and picks somebody else up and takes them up individually. And you can see, I can see that happening quite frequently, because especially as you get older, I think when you're younger, you want the socialization part of it, and when you get older, you kind of want to be by yourself sometimes. So there's an interesting evolution of the requirements that we may drive as consumers. But the last part I'll talk about as well is I think that the city transit bus definitely will disappear sometime over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. Because if you look at the city transit bus, for example, and living near Detroit, and I see it, if you live, even in Jackson has some bus routes, but that bus is empty so much of the time. It is probably one of the worst utilized mechanisms to get people around. And we're paying a driver to drive around this $300,000 bus that gets 5 miles to the gallon because it's on a fixed route to go pick up people that are never there. So they're there sometimes. They're there in the morning from 6 to 9, and they're there in the evening from like 4 to 7 for the most part. And the rest of the time, the utilization is really terrible. So I could easily see this becoming the public autonomous transport, which could be the size of a minivan, and you just put more of them online when it's busy, and you take them offline to go get cleaned up, to recharge, repaired, or whatever when they're not there, or to take shipments around. There's all kinds of different ways to utilize a smaller vehicle like that, and you're not paying the driver anymore either. So our team developed this. It's based upon a nonlinear projection. It's a series of the engineers in here will love this, okay, because it's using a series of causal variables and differential equations to build out this. It was a model developed about 50 years ago by a professor at Purdue University. It's called the Bass diffusion model. It's quite interesting, and it attempts to project based upon these different characteristics in here that you might have around autonomous aspects, especially cost and customer willingness and technology maturity, as well as the mobility side around enabled miles and competitive market passenger miles, and we'll talk about that a bit. But it's to drive nonlinear growth. Not linear, as Jeff was talking about, that slow growth kind of thing, but what happens when something makes a sea change in a marketplace? Oh, like this guy, too. Right? So in 2006, nobody had one of these because it didn't exist. And in 2007, I made fun of it because I loved my BlackBerry. And it took me another 3 years to convert, and it's like, why did I wait so long? So that's the kind of change that we're trying to figure out here, and we're all talking about. The question is the when. So the colors got kind of screwed up in the translation here. My apologies. So they're all supposed to be these colors over here on the right side. So the orange up, this light yellow orange is actually supposed to be black. I don't know how it converted like that. And the orange in here is supposed to be this gray. So it's shared autonomous in here, and this is private autonomous up here, and this is non-autonomous, the blue. And this is based upon miles traveled. So our team, I would call them mainly millennials, looked at this and kind of said, what's really driving the industry? And we think about it in vehicles and parts and those kinds of things. And they think about it in how do I get someplace? And how long does it take me, or how far is it away? So they converted this over to how many miles get traveled. And you can see the white bars here are 2025. So frankly, it's kind of the same old for the next 7, maybe 10 years even. So there's a runway out here. It's not like there's a crisis happening, next year, or tomorrow. But the runway does end. Just like any runway, it's not a gradual end when it ends, if you're on the plane. And so if the plane's not getting off the ground soon enough, you got a problem. The runway ends abruptly. And this is the abrupt change that we think occurs somewhere with autonomous out here, probably in the early 30s, some time frame in there. That's what our model is projecting. We can change that if we change some of the factors, but it's based upon, so who takes autonomous vehicles and who drives in cars? And you see the huge growth in miles traveled up here, really driven by, I'd call it by not just population growth, but by taking market share. So it's taking market share away from mass transit, city buses, light trains. It's taking market share away from short flights, like why do you fly from Detroit to Lansing when it's a 1-hour drive? But there's still flights, there's 4 flights a day, I think, something like that. So there's no need for those kinds of things in the future. This is a huge growth in miles traveled. And a lot of it, as you get out in the future, is this thing called the shared autonomous model. There's private vehicles too, because some people still want to own their own vehicles and miles and it gets traveled. But we think the whole idea of a privately driven car that you control yourself, because of some of the, not only the safety characteristics are really driving, or safety requirements are driving the technology, which then says, why do you want to drive yourself? There's really no reason if you're just trying to get from where you are now to work or to go to the store. The fun for driving still exists, and we think that there'll be vehicles out here because they'll be out there, but it'll be more like owning a horse today. Because does anybody own a horse here? And do you keep your horse next to your house? Oh, you probably live on a farm then. That's not fair. But if you own a horse, most of the time it's going to be a farm. It's got to be out away from it's not in the middle of the city, right? So it's not your major mode of transportation, I don't think, is it? Okay. So you do it for fun because you love horses, right? And there are people like us, I love cars too. My kids think I'm nuts, right? But I love my car, even though I had a flat tire this morning. But it'll be more for fun. So there'll be some of those vehicles out here. What this model also predicts, though, is vehicles in operation that are out here on the road, in the park, if you think, and population will go down by probably 50%. This is going up to 2050. You probably did notice that in here. We decided we wanted to take it out way in the future because it's hard to see change happening in 10 years and 15. But what happens if it keeps going? And what happens in our society and to us as an industry if we really go out that far? But yeah, if it's half as much, then some of the naysayers that say this is the demise of the industry could say that might be correct because the number of vehicles in operation, they're really busy out here. They're not running, as I mentioned to some of the guys at lunch, the average vehicle last year ran for 56 minutes a day, 1 hour approximately, right? 4% on a 24-hour day utilization. If our factories ran at 4%, Craig would probably fire the guys, right? But we don't think we can get to 100% because that's probably not realistic. We're not going to stay awake 24 hours a day. But even if you take conservative numbers, which we did in the model, if we go to 5 hours a day, okay, so that's 5 times as much utilization. 12,000 miles a year is the average for a vehicle, so 5 times, so 60,000 miles a year on the vehicle in that case. And vehicles today, average life is 180,000 miles. So 60, 3-year life, not 15 years. Vehicles are going to wear out. The metals, having worked in metals before, it fatigues, plastics wear out. Maybe there's aftermarket for a lot of that stuff, but at some point, it's kind of like any kind of repair. You're going to say, enough, got to replace it. Time to get rid of it, move on. So our model actually took into account then how long does the vehicle last? How many miles per day does it end up being driven? We went up to 40% was kind of the max in here, so that's about 10 hours on utilization way out in the future if we really get good at this stuff. And we actually increased the life of the vehicle to 400,000. We actually went to 700,000 and 800,000 miles to see what would happen in the model. This is at 400,000 miles for a vehicle. That means we have to make our cars, on average, last 400,000 miles versus 180 today. That's a lot, don't you think? Most people say the car's going to wear out pretty quick, but it's putting a lot of miles on. It's putting on 100, 120,000 miles a year. So the average is about 3.5 years for the life of a car, which is why we create this churn in here. So actually, annual new vehicle sales go up in this world, in this model here. That's why I say it's not so bad if you look at it and try to figure out what's really the life of the vehicle and how long is it going to last. And it's still a lot of shared that's out here. We've worked with our clients. We'll have working sessions where we'll actually input, what do you think is going to be different, and see what the impact is. And so if you take it down at like 200,000 miles like today, then it was kind of unreal. Annual new vehicle sales just skyrocketed. Because it's kind of like the vehicles, they don't last but a year and a half in that case. So we wanted to temper the expectations a little bit. But we think this is a tremendous opportunity. But the vehicles are very different in the future. They also have electric. As I mentioned earlier, this is taking the same model and adopting electrification powertrains to it, using a different set of variables to add to the equation in this case. But you can see in this case, we're already fairly well down the road, but it's not. If I look at that, internal combustion engines will still dominate the architectures of the vehicles in 25. The sea change occurs out here in the mid-30s, mainly driven by cost factors. When does cost parity really occur between battery and electric, and when does the infrastructure also come into play? So when do these things all come into play? And this is US. So if we do this for Europe and for China, for other countries as well, but in Europe and China, we've done the same forecasts for our clients there. It's about 5 to 7 years earlier. It's going to be probably more like the early 30s, late 20s, where you'll see a major change in this case, nonlinear now, where suddenly the runway ended and there's a major change in the way we operate our vehicles in the future. And the implications, Craig talked about it as well. These are internal combustion engine components. You make some of these parts today. Not one of these is needed on an electric vehicle. 0. For our clients that make engines and transmission components, I'm amazed sometimes how that surprises them, that they didn't quite understand that's what's going to occur in the future. But there's a runway, so it's not time to panic, it's a time to position. How do you position your company then in the future? Because the future is going to be these kinds of things: battery packs, traction motors, inverters. There's a gearbox. We didn't get a picture of that up here. It's probably a 1-speed, maybe a 2-speed gearbox. So, clutches, not so much need for clutches in the future. And the impact for them and for suppliers really comes around, this is a Disney concept, around content per vehicle. And so we also work this into what's the financial implication to your company on content per vehicle. And this is an example here of transmission, suspension, engine changes over this time frame based upon the forecast, and then where your electric components, where you could position yourself to grow in the future. A couple other slides in here we'll whip through just conceptually because it's been talked about already, but architectures. Current ICE architecture, fairly complex with engines and transmissions. This is a frame, it's a truck. Electric vehicles, this idea of a skateboard chassis. This is the Faraday Future chassis. I don't know if they'll ever come to production with it, if you keep track of Faraday, but there's a few other skateboard chassis ideas out there. So they're not the only ones. It's just that it's really quite interesting because this is a battery pack, and it's got a traction motor underneath here, but the whole idea is that if I have an autonomous shared vehicle, and we talked about it, do I care what it looks like when I get into it? Do I care what my Uber vehicle looks like? Somebody asked about, right? No, when I get in now, I want it to be clean. I don't want to sit on a piece of gum. That's happened to me too. So, that was kind of a mess in my suit. But there's an opportunity to build a much higher volume, kind of common architecture for these vehicles that will never exceed the speed limit, will never over-accelerate at certain times, and it'll always communicate and be connected with other vehicles out there. Here's a picture on interiors. And Jeff showed that earlier. We like to show this one just to show the evolution for generations. Going back to, this is some of the Chevy interiors, very traditional, that we all drive today. More technology, a little nicer in this one here because we went from the cheap plastic now up to like nicer surfaces up here finally. That consumers kind of say we want that stuff. This is a Model 3 from Tesla. This kind of shook up the interior business, I would say, Jeff. When Tesla said it, but when people actually looked at it, who's gotten into a Model 3 in here? It's interesting, isn't it, when you sit down in there? What do you look for, right? Because all you got is the screen. It is barren. There's nothing else up there. And I've been in some other test environments as well. This is where the interiors are going. A much cleaner piece of this. No knobs, vent louvers, things that kind of break. That stuff is all going to be disappearing. And this is the future, which Jeff showed a lot of, potentially is the third living space, right? That whole idea of a living area. So it's all about the experience in the future. And your experience isn't going to be under the hood. It's not going to be, it's not going to be part of the engine. It's going to be the interior of the vehicle itself. The implication for suppliers especially, going from now to the future, and we like this chart because it really shows we're going from vehicles produced to miles driven, to this idea of mobility as a service, to this idea of skateboard platforms, and we think down here, this idea of, the OEMs cannot afford to do everything, to do all of it. And we think that some OEMs may choose to be vehicle guys, and some will choose to be, I want to be in that mobility as a service area. I want to be part of that group that's making all the money, charging you for rides in the future. And how much revenue and profit can they make off of something like that, which is exactly where, it's not only the data, we think, but it's also the service side that a Waymo and these others are looking at. So this chart also shows the value chain and where you may be as a supplier in here versus how does it feed into this idea of mobility as a service and mobility operations. And somebody still has to build vehicles, somebody has to own them, but then there's all a set of services. It's the data, but it's also, who's going to make sure that the rides happen, who's going to clean the vehicle and repair it in the future, who's going to operate these things, and who's going to be optimizing the traffic and the route flows and the like. So we use our structure around strategy and strategic planning. We use this usually as a kickoff to the organization to think about, okay, what's the future look like? Now let's make it back to how do we work our business models and our business strategies into the future. So with that, I think we have some Q&A.
You talked about about vehicle volumes potentially going up. Do you have some sense of magnitude? Is it, we're at 17 million today. Could it be over 20 million?
Yeah, actually it's interesting. So in the model itself, it depends upon the drivers you put in there. So we're at 17.2 is what it generally, Jeff, that's probably generally people are thinking today for this year. In the model, it actually climbs up to close to 25 million, but there's a mixture then of these privately driven and autonomous vehicles. So you get this double whammy for a while. And we think it flatlines, in this model anyway, in the US, probably around 23, 24 million. And then it gets to be more of a constant state because your vehicles it's all about miles driven. So if we increase the transportation needs, if we have an influx, more people want to use vehicles. If the older population, as we get older, we start using more, we travel more maybe, it could go up higher than that. But probably somewhere in that, I'd say mid-20s is probably, in the model, the way we set it up today is a plateau.
Okay. So if you're a supplier in the tier 1, tier 2 space and you're looking at future volumes potentially going up, is it, and obviously the vehicle changing, where do you see the biggest subsystems or vehicle systems that are going to be impacted by that kind of growth, and how that infrastructure looks?
Well, it's interesting. The whole idea of using skateboards and common architectures or common platforms, for example, on an electric drive, even though that Tesla would go out and say we can use their crazy level of speed, 0 to 60 in 2.7 seconds, right? With 2 traction motors and it's all-wheel drive. Ludicrous mode. Thank you. Yeah. But in an autonomous world, I don't care about that so much, right? That's just kind of for fun. So we think that the electric drive, the drivetrain, has a potential probably of really being commonized into much higher volumes actually than what they are today. So the key to that one would be being the supplier on components for that, kind of quote, if you want to think about the standard drivetrain of the future, maybe instead of thinking about, we're thinking too small, instead of thinking about 200,000 units a year, it's 2 million, right? It's 5 million. I mean, that kind of a world in the future with all these common architectures is huge for the guys who win. For the guys who lose, it's 0, right? So that's a big problem. The interiors, we think, on the flip side, probably have lots of variation and variety, because now it's all about your experience in the future. It's all about what you like yourself and how that can be, how can it fit your lifestyle and your world. So if you're a young person, you may, like my kids, they want to go places with their friends, right? So it's more of a social environment. As I said earlier, maybe it's because I'm getting old, so I like to go by myself a lot of times, right? So there may be more of a private environment, but the technology access, the comfort, how the air feels inside the vehicle is going to be huge. It won't be it can't be the traditional old vent louvers where the air's blowing in the face on the passenger, right? And the guys in the back seat can't feel anything. So there's going to be technologies around some of that on the interior space to really make it a great experience for the comfort side. So there's real opportunities, we think, on the interior side for differentiation.
Okay. So you and Jeff both talked about, disruption and the OEM, the horse and buggy thing. And so I'll ask you a similar question to what I asked him. We have these traditional OEMs, right? So which ones do you think are best positioned to be on the right side of that equation and be the ones who actually move into this new mobility world?
Yeah, that's the crystal ball out.
You said you didn't want softball questions.
I know that. Thank you. And you've complied. He's right. GM has probably been the leader as far as investing heavily in an autonomous side. That doesn't mean that they have an insurmountable lead by any means, right? So I think one of the challenges for all the OEMs is that, and having worked in their environments as well, is they don't have enough capital to do everything on that last slide I showed, right? To be the actual, they can't be the supplier, the designer, the maker, the owner of the fleets in the future for sharing, the service provider for the fleets. They think, and the data holders for all that stuff. So they're going to look at it, and which GM and I think Ford and BMW, a number of others are all looking at it very aggressively. Where do they make the most money in the future? And how do they drive shareholder value up, right? What's going to juice up the stock price, which is pretty terrible today, right? Hopefully you don't own too much GM or Ford stock, but it's not doing well. So the question is, where do they position themselves along the value chain? Because I don't believe that any of the OEMs can actually afford to do all of that. So then I think they're going to probably choose to go more toward the right side, as you saw up here, which then means, where's the gap? Who's going to design, who's going to build all these vehicles out here? So the definition of an OEM, original equipment manufacturer, may look a lot different in the future. So I don't know there really will be OEMs. Supplier may be the OEM in this case, right? The supplier can come out with a standardized architecture to build all these pieces or pieces of it. Because if I had a skateboard architecture and I just had different top hats to put on top of it and different interiors to plug into it, it's much more modular, then it's a whole different kind of business model in that case. So, but I would say if I were going to go back to your question, so I'll answer, the domestic US guys are definitely aggressively looking at it, except for Chrysler, as Jeff said. FCA is very happy being the provider to Waymo without getting any access to their technology. The Germans, the Europeans, the Renaults and PSAs are looking aggressively at this stuff as well. The Japanese are the ones that aren't sure what this whole mobility as a service means to them yet. So they're the ones that, now they can catch up, but I think they also are always ones that have always struggled a little bit with trying to be the leader of the pack on some of these things. So that could be a real risk to the big Japanese OEMs. They may wind up being, it may not be a bad thing to just be if you may call them tier 2 or tier 1, but maybe they're still the OEM. They just make the product because somebody has to make millions and millions of these products out here. And we think that that model fits across the globe. So if we had a growth like that across the globe, we'd wind up with a $150 million industry in a number of years. 150 million unit industry, sorry.
You brought up something interesting that I was going to ask. So we've got these sort of mega tier 1 suppliers, right? These super tier 1s, and they're multi-billion-dollar companies, mergers that have occurred. Back in the old days, we had Magna that was the 0.5 tier supplier. So is there a chance that these guys really become much more of a partner with these traditional OEMs to be able to help provide this mobility?
Yeah, I think you may not see all that happen in 2019, but I think that over the next 5 to 7 years, you'll see a lot more of that. So if it's 0.5 may become, they just, they come together, and that's just another layer in the whole value chain or supply chain that's out there. So I think the big guys especially are looking at integration going far beyond kind of their current definitions of integration out here. And they're going to need other suppliers below them to help support even higher levels. So as they move up that direction, they can't afford to do it all either. So they're going to be relying on someone who makes better components in certain areas or better subsystems that plug into their systems or into their vehicles if they get into that kind of business.
So last question then. Craig talked about it a little bit before you spoke. How do companies like Team One and many other suppliers that are out here align themselves with these disruptors? So how do they know how to identify them? How do they know who to connect with?
Yeah, I think the first, this is not AA, Craig, but, but the first step is kind of acknowledging there's a problem, right? Because some suppliers, I've been in discussions where they've gotten into shouting matches, right? Because one end of the table kind of says, that's a lot of crap out there, right? I don't believe any of that's going to happen. Hasn't happened for the last 20 years. It's not going to happen again. A lot of dealers are thinking that way, frankly, if you listen to some of the dealers out there. So they don't quite get it yet. So first of it's acknowledging there's a potential problem or challenge out there. Then I think it's, and what we like to do with our clients in this case is just go through the same process and let's lay out, where's your value add in the whole industry today? What is it you supply and what are you really good at doing? And then go through the discussion, where do we think the industry's going and how does that align up with what you're doing well? And where can you potentially position your core competencies and capabilities to really engage with that in the future? Got to survive today, got to keep growing today with some of those same components because you have those programs that are already awarded, but they may not get awarded in 22 and 23, right? So that's the whole transition is the difficult part, and laying out a real game plan for how that's going to occur. And that's going to occur with not only the organization and your products, but your people, because your people skills will be dramatically different in the future too.
Okay. So we're going to take a brief break. I want to remind you guys to please put more questions in. We're going to have a panel here after this short break with all of our speakers to wrap up the day. So if not, I can just call on you because I know some of you have questions. So we'll take a break and do a little bit of furniture moving.
10 minutes and then we'll be right back here and we'll wrap up with the final panel. Final cage match.
One question I didn't ask you guys when we were in the individual sessions was about Tesla itself, which always tends to be sort of an interesting topic. So I'm just curious briefly for each of you to kind of talk about what's your feeling about Tesla long term, its viability. There's been a lot of controversy this year. What's your thought? Go ahead, Daron, why don't you start?
Okay. Can you hear me okay? So I started working with Tesla in 2009, and everybody said that they were never going to make it in 2009. And suddenly Daimler invested $50 million in May of 2009, and suddenly they were viable because they put a valuation on them for 10% it was $500 million. Daimler made a fortune off of their investment in Tesla. Every time that I give the Tesla team credit for it's very talented. They had lots of turnover, and Elon is kind of a brilliant mastermind behind it. So I think that Tesla, actually, I'm pretty optimistic that Tesla will continue on because he seems to have a way of pulling the rabbit out of the hat, even when things get down. Eventually, I don't know that Tesla is actually survives on its own if it doesn't get folded into something else in the longer term. But I think that met with the team out there. I mean, even though it's young and radical, and I think they're a very talented group. So I'm more pro than not.
Jeff?
I guess similar to the tweet comment I said about the Washington, I'd say the same thing here. It ebbs and flows by some of the actions that have happened this year. I think right now, I would totally agree. Give them a lot of credit for what they've built. I think it's a fantastic model. It has been very disruptive to the industry, and it's been good for the industry. I think there's a few things that I'm looking at that suggest there's some challenges ahead. And I wouldn't say we're not bearish on them necessarily, but I think from a competitive model, he really hasn't had competition. He's going to. His price point with the credits is going to be a challenge. I think we still have to see what kind of quality Model 3 has. I think that could be a challenge as well. I mean, historically, the quality hasn't been up to standards, with the rest of the major OEMs. So how forgiving is the Model 3 buyer going to be in that space? So I think there's a lot of challenges ahead. But to Daron's point, he's been able to get through those, even his own personal mouth challenges. I certainly wouldn't write Tesla off, but I also would agree that at some point they probably get folded in before it plays completely out.
Completely disagree with Jeff. Introduce the cage match aspect.
That's how it's going to be.
Right. No, not entirely true. So I would say we've gone down the road as YF and JCI before that with Fisker, with all kinds, Neo, SF Motors, V Vehicle. I don't know if you guys remember V Vehicle. Frank Verasano started a car company. We were in that. So lots of experience of things not working out. I am strike that. I was a complete Tesla skeptic because I've gone through all of those other iterations. But every time I vote against Tesla, they beat me, and I'm tired of being wrong, honestly. So my personal opinion is that, and I would say this is probably the YF opinion, we are a supplier to Tesla, We ship, so this is where I challenged Jeff, conversation at lunch, I challenged Jeff Graff on Tesla. We ship 6,000 parts a week for the Model 3 right now. If that keeps up, that's 300,000 Model 3s next year, let alone Model S's, Model Ys, Model X's, et cetera. I do think, and there's a lot of rumors going around Silicon Valley, that Tesla gets bought. Elon Musk doesn't want to make cars, he wants to change the world. He's already kind of made his claim. So what a great deal if Apple buys Tesla. Apple immediately gets the car manufacturing. They get now a platform to apply their user experience into. That's a pure rumor, by the way. I have no inside information for that. But to me, that makes a ton of sense. Someone who wants to get into that space, who needs an electric platform, Tesla's ready-made, and people who buy Teslas are rabidly excited about their Tesla. You may think it's a strange car, it's kind of cute or whatever. Those people will punch you in the face if you tell them that Tesla's not a good car. Actually, they'll just call you stupid. You're from Detroit, you don't understand. People who buy Teslas are in love with their Tesla.
Or you're old and you don't understand. That's what I hear from my employees. You're old, you don't understand.
Just a little disclaimer on the graph, that was US only. You're shipping to the rest of the world.
Fair point. Touche.
Jeff Stout, just one question, maybe an unfair question, but can you talk a little bit, since you seem to be pretty open about talking about unfair questions. I didn't really ask you about what it's like to be working for a Chinese company right now. So how is the transition? What's it like working for a large tier 1 that's Chinese owned?
That's a long conversation that typically requires beer. Generally, I would say it's positive. In our situation, the relationship's about a little over 2 years old. They generally let each region do their own thing. So we go after our business, and we're led by Americans. Most of the people on the team are American. We've got a handful of Chinese folks on the team, but in general, there's a lot of autonomy there. An interesting side note that nobody should quote me on because it might get me in trouble. China, this is another conversation we had at lunch. China, in general, doesn't have a lot of global brands. There was mention of GAC opening an office in the US. GAC doesn't sell cars in the US yet, not because GAC doesn't want to or that they couldn't. The government doesn't want them to, because for those who have been around long enough, you saw the Brilliance vehicle that went through the safety crash test and it folded in half. That was a huge embarrassment for the Chinese government. That won't happen again. They won't have a car in production in the US until they know it'll be okay. So the fact that there's a Chinese-led multinational in Europe and in the US, that's a big deal to China. The Chinese government is very aware of my company, which feels weird to say, because if we fail, it makes them look bad. So we literally have the nation of China cheering for us that we need to be successful. That provides a lot of support. So when you need help and we say, hey, we need some engineers from China get on a plane and they come fly and help, because they are gonna make sure we're successful.
Okay. Jeff, there's been a lot of recent announcements from both Ford and General Motors about sort of restructuring in the business or layoffs that they're offering. We heard a little bit about GM earlier. I'm curious from your analyst perspective, what are you seeing with these restructurings? What are you hearing? You know, how does this play itself out, and why do you think these are happening now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we completely agree on this. The restructuring is all about getting to that autonomy point. So I think GM sees that. I should say GM's restructuring. Ford's restructuring is probably a little bit different, or maybe a lot different, and should have happened a lot sooner than it's happening. But I think nonetheless, it all adds complexity, and I think a bit of dynamic nature to the current environment. You know, if we're trying to get to that end point, and we have OEMs that are kind of managing that way, it is going to affect, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to affect programs in the near to midterm, and there are going to be some programs that are canceled. So I think it really puts a lot of pressure on the supply base all the way through the tiers to really pay attention to what's happening, not only from the launches that are taking place now, how well they're doing, but how that might impact future launches. And I don't think we're just talking about sedans. We're talking about SUV launches that some of them are in question, some iterations of vehicles that you might have seen fragment further than what we're looking at now from a standpoint will continue to being questioned, and I think there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on programs in general. So this next 2, 3, 5-year period is probably going to be quite challenging, I think, in that respect.
Daron, what do you think about a similar question regarding the Asians? I mean, even their stock price has dropped, which is somewhat abnormal for them, right? Honda's doing poorly. Obviously, sedans is part of the mix, but anything about the Asians that you think about that, you know, do they need to restructure as well? Are they looking at things differently?
They're starting to think about it. That's what, and I say that very specifically because they're only starting to think about it for the most part. It's one of the challenges I think that the Japanese and the Koreans have is that they've made really good cars. They've done a good job of integrating operations over here in this area. But this next transition, which is where Jeff's talking about it, others, the GM and Fords are looking at, they need a different type of expertise to move into this new space if they're going to move into more of this technology type of area. So I think the stock prices are reflecting some of the same things. It's a little bit later maybe than what the U.S. market looks at, which is every one of the car companies is looking at how do we avoid becoming a commodity in the market's view. How do we become more like the technology guys where we're adding value, whether it's data or it's other kind of intellectual property, right? So that's kind of where the value equation is from a market standpoint today. So I think that's where the Asians are suffering a little bit because they have a lot of intellectual property out there. They don't know exactly what to do with it or where to position themselves, in my opinion anyway, at this point in time. Doesn't mean that they won't catch up quickly, but I think they may be the ones that decide they want to be the makers of the cars in the future. Right? So that may be the position that they end up taking.
Okay. So we have some folks here that are Michigan government folks that are here that support manufacturing within the state of Michigan. And one of the questions is, what can Michigan and the legislature do to support the future of automotive? And I guess I'm open to whoever wants to take a stab at that, either from a manufacturing analyst perspective.
I can jump in with a real quick suck-up comment. In general, I think they're already doing it. If you look back 5 years ago, what we were doing, maybe it wasn't nothing, but it was dangerously close to nothing. If you look at the work that's going on with MICHauto and Plante and all of, Trevor Paul does a fabulous job of driving a conversation, and not just him, but inside the leadership of the MEDC and all the way up to Governor Snyder. I'm not that big of a deal, and it's a huge shock to all of you. But I've had discussions with MEDC where they're saying, okay, we'll bring this to the governor, and I don't talk to governors. That's not what I should be. Michigan is open to doing whatever it takes to drive a mindset of change. And so I think we're doing all the right things. We just have to do more and faster.
I would take it a little further, I think, and at least this is my perspective, because in the role we have as consulting, a lot of times we're working with our clients trying to figure out where to put production sites, for example, in the future. I would say that the southern states, if I go to North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee especially, to me, they are much more aggressive than the state of Michigan is, as far as actually trying to reach out, because they've actually scheduled meetings with me in the last 6 months, each of those, just to meet and talk and introduce their team, or they do rotations. So they're just much more aggressive at reaching out and getting a hold of the people to try and market the state. And they're putting a lot of incentives in there too. And so those are the kind of things I think in the state of Michigan, I don't get the feeling that we're as aggressive as they are doing those kinds of things as far as going after those kind of plants. And this is part of why, like in Alabama, eventually won the Toyota Mazda JV down there. There was quite a fight between North Carolina and Alabama at the end to try and get that done. So I think that's one of the things for the state of Michigan, I'd encourage you to let's figure out a really focused effort to get much more aggressive. I guess, not just say that, hey, we had a great state. We need to go out and really reach out to people.
And if I can bring it together, I would say maybe balance. So, you've got manufacturing, you've got tech. And I think there have been some tech wins and certainly some push on the tech side. So maybe it's finding a balance between those two as we, progress down the road.
So the follow-up question to that was any worries about changes in the administration that are coming in January in Michigan and federal, and at the federal level. Do you think they'll hinder any of these changes that we're talking about for the future of automotive?
For me in the state of Michigan, the conversations I've had, no, that there's relative to the mobility space, there's plenty of other political differences and policy differences, but relative to the conversations that Rick Snyder's been driving in the mobility space, Whitmer's going to continue driving.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the impression I have at the state level. I think the whole fight over the EPA and trying to pull back on some of the requirements around fuel economy and the like, and then GM's rebuttal, and it's kind of the back and forth. We're clearly out of sync from the industry to the federal government kind of view of the world right now. So that's going to have to get consistent, because in the meantime, California's going to keep doing what California wants to do, right?
Jeff Schuster, maybe you could take this one. There was a question about sort of infrastructure of EVs, and we talk about Southeast Detroit, we talk about Chicago, New York, but we're sitting here in Albion, Michigan, so the whole concept of EVs here and this geofencing that you talked about, is the infrastructure going to be here? Will it be ready for when you're predicting EVs to be in the market?
Well, that's one of the big issues, and why it, part of why it hasn't been sooner. And I didn't talk a lot about. I had some conversations offline, but I didn't talk a lot about some of the risks to volume in the EV space, and even to our forecast. Frankly, infrastructure is a big piece of that. Obviously, the price equilibrium, when that happens, we're looking at mid 20s, 2022, 2023-ish for that. Battery obviously is still there from a risk standpoint. Infrastructure is a big piece. You have a lot of different issues going on with that. So it's just actually having charging stations. It's the fact that there isn't a standardized charge from a fast charge standpoint. Everybody's got their own technologies, and it's still, from a convenience standpoint, let's face it, consumers want to be able to charge their vehicle like they fill up their gas. Their gas tank. So until you can get it down to 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes is acceptable, but 5 minutes, that's when you start to see that exponential change in terms of adoption. So we're anticipating some of that coming in, with our, fairly aggressive curve when you look past 2020. So that all plays a role there, but charging stations are a huge element of that.
Yeah, the only addition to that I would say is as you move then beyond ownership into fleet, now suddenly I've got a single owner of a fleet who can then have a centralized charging station rather than the distributed charging station that we anticipate for the next 10, 15 years. And that changes quite a bit as well.
And if they're autonomous vehicles, then you don't have to wait for them anymore.
Exactly.
That's part of where the enablement is really critical in here. I think that the electrical infrastructure is interesting. We've met with a number of utilities, and it's at the power plant level, they actually, at least we meet with them, there's actually a lot of confidence that we actually have a lot of generation capability already, because all this renewable energy is coming into place, and it's actually supplanting some of the traditional energy, natural gas or coal potentially, or some of the nuclear. It's the last leg is the problem. It's how do you get it from, it's kind of like the last mile in logistics. How do you get it down to your house level, right? So that part's missing at this point, which is what the Jeffs are talking about on the charging station side. And so once we kind of build some of that out, and you have charging stations, as plentiful as gas stations around, then there's a major change in our behavior, because then we don't think about it anymore. It's just going to go plug in somewhere.
Right. Okay. Jeff Stout, I ask you this question as a manufacturer. So there's a question about this sort of new generation of employee. Some may call it millennials. There's whatever the new generation is, but how do you think they will change this automotive marketplace? And will it happen faster than we might have done it when we came out of college? So give your sense from a manufacturer perspective. What are they doing to impact the business?
So we have a fair number of millennials that work with us. I enjoy working with them. Sometimes they're funny. But in general, to some degree or another, it's a little bit funny to me. And then when I came out Gen X, those Gen X guys are apathetic, and it's like, okay, it kind of feels like we're saying the same thing about the millennials. To some degree or another, it's just young people who do things differently, and so then it's just bad. I do think collectively millennials are pretty impatient. Personally, I find that to be refreshing. I don't take it as an affront if somebody who's working for me as a 22-year-old kid, after 6 months says, okay, I know everything I can possibly learn from you, I want the next thing. Okay, it's a little bit arrogant, but at the end of the day, he wants next, and okay, let's go do that. But I do think there's something rewarding about that relative to this question that says the people that I think are going to be in the plants, whether it's the individual hourly worker or whether it's the line leader or whether it's the tech manager, I think there's going to be a much greater diversity of product and process that we have to manage. And so you don't want to have what we have kind of grown up to accept today of the specialist of I'm the black belt and this person over here is the quality engineer and then this person over here does manufacturing engineering. I think there's going to be, in the future, technical roles. And you're just going to move around to do whatever needs to be done under the umbrella of I have technical skills. And we're not going to have this siloed sense of, well, I only do this slice of the technical things that need to get done. And I think the millennials are particularly well suited to thrive in that environment and not need just a really strong box to play in. They want to play in a big box and do a bunch of different stuff. I think that's what we're going to need.
Daron, I'll ask you this question. The question is, are we looking hard enough at the social aspects, which may actually be far larger than the technical aspects? What if the consumer revolts about being mined?
But being mined, like for data, for
Right.
information.
Right.
Well, we probably are not looking hard enough at some of those things as a society even, and there's lots of challenges around who owns the data and who protects you from the data. That's why Europe went through this whole legislative process at the end of May. I forget the acronym for it now. It's protecting the individual's data. So it's one of the reasons actually in our model for Europe, for autonomous vehicles, we actually slowed down the growth in there because of the regulatory aspects of who has access to the data is a much bigger deal in Europe than it is here in the U.S. Here in the U.S., probably like you guys, if I put a new app on there, they always ask me the question, right? And I always say accept. I don't read the thing, right? Who in here has read one of those? Right? We have no idea what we're actually giving up, our liberties about, right? So they can look at everything. So we're way too willing to accept that, I think, at this point in time. I think the security issues are going to become a bigger deal. That's going to drive a whole other level of services and capabilities that the millennials actually are really engaged with too. It's a whole different set of issues I think that we face. So the behavior side, I think, on data is one aspect. I think the behavior side, frankly, on how you use the vehicles is another aspect as well. It's back to the point of do you want to share a vehicle or not? If you get in a vehicle with 2 or 3 other people, what if you get in an argument, right? So how do you behave with each other? How's that going to occur? How do you prevent something bad from happening in an environment like that? That's going to be something that challenges us. And how do we take care of things? It's kind of like the latest rage are all these electric scooters, I think, in cities, right? Where you can just pick it up and dump it off, right? And then they have these piles of scooters all over the place. It's driving cities crazy, right? That they've got this mess now. And it's such a cool idea to have, right? So we're not really good at behavior change ourselves. So I think there's a lot of that that's why it's a long runway. It's going to take a while to play out completely. That's why you see in our model too, all the curves, they don't really change dramatically for another 10 years, somewhere in there. But then when it changes and we kind of get some of the rules in place, then I think that's when you see some big changes.
It's interesting you say that we get our phones and we just hit accept and we don't do anything about it. But working in manufacturing consulting, there's this whole concept of Industry 4.0 and connectivity of your plants, your machines, your data. Right. And the companies are like, no way. We're not going to connect my machines to the outside cloud-based world. We wouldn't want them to know. So we're very careful with our equipment, but we'll let anybody know anything we want from our phone, right?
Although just a real quick anecdote, 2 of them on the response to that. Number one, giving up data. There was just a news article about a month ago where Starbucks, I don't think it was corporate global, it was just a region, offered a free cup of coffee if you gave them permission to access all of your data on your phone. And then they published results of how many people said yes to that and how many people said no to that. I don't know what the absolute number was, but the percentage was 100% said, give me the free coffee. $2. For $2, I will give you all my data. What would I do for hundreds of dollars of mobility service? Geez, you can have my leg. I don't care. The other one we think about this a lot. Apologize for the PG-13 nature of this comment. But there's always questions about what are people going to do in the car? Because, back when I was young, we used to, are they going to do that? Is there going to be sex in cars without drivers? And the reality is, yeah, that's gonna happen.
Drinking.
But the difference is, connected to the data, the car will Sorry, guys. The car will know that you're having sex in the car, and they'll know who you are because you called the car. And so the real social challenge will be, what do you do with somebody who acts badly in a car? Can I tell them you're no longer allowed to use my platform anymore? And I take away mobility as an option for someone? Is that a social right that Waymo has, that they can blackball somebody because they do bad things in the car, have a cigarette, something like that? Those are social questions, are fascinating, and we don't know.
Or do you have sex cars and cigarette cars?
Drinking. And
That had never crossed my mind.
Drinking cars and marijuana cars.
Drinking
Now
cars.
in Michigan, it's marijuana cars. Okay, so last question for each of you. You all, talk to a lot of industry folks, a lot of OEMs, a lot of tier ones. What are you hearing? What are they concerned about? What are the big, large companies concerned about? And what should some of our small manufacturers be thinking about as it relates to their concerns?
I think, back to that point made earlier, I think short term, at least at the OEM and tier one levels, they're actually the most significant, because right now is launch. Just to be really short term oriented, is that they have all these launches happening and they don't have enough people or expertise, to put it that way, to make it happen. And so they're really leaning on the suppliers. You guys feel it, I'm sure, out here, right? On the suppliers to help support these launches. And if they don't make them, if they miss their timelines, that's money out of their pocket, right? So that's a huge immediate concern. Going beyond that, next generation is some of the same things we talked about here, is that they're having a tough time figuring out what that vehicle is going to look like. So even though this platform is going to run at the 23 or 24, there's a lot of concern of over-investing into a platform that's obsolete then, in 25 or 26. And so I think you're seeing capital diverting away from internal combustion engine type technologies on the powertrain side, moving to electric. I think VW this morning announced, was it a $50 billion investment, I think, in electric and autonomous vehicles. Nobody knows exactly what that means, but it's a big number they're putting out there. So that's the next big concern, is where's the capital going to go for this next generation? That's what I hear anyway.
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, I would say for me in the short term, the drum is beating a little bit harder on, what kind of a volume pullback are we going to see over the next couple of years. So it's more top line related, and then how that spills down to the program level. And and then the transition that we've been under to the SUV. I think beyond that, it really is kind of building on what Daron said, balancing that midterm horizon, so out through 2025. And if we start to see a more concentrated pullback in programs and launches, which I think is certainly a possibility as we try to balance that investment and capital needs towards the longer term. I think that's a risk in that period, and I think that certainly will ripple through the supply base. So that's something that we're watching very closely. There have been some signals that that's going to continue to be an issue, and then ultimately it's how do you transition your company to meet the needs in the mobility world of tomorrow? And again, I would still say the return on investment isn't going to be there for a little while. So it's finding those resources and being able to ride it out.
Yeah, I think I would answer it longer than I should, sorry. From an automaker standpoint, the biggest change that I've seen in their behavior has been, if you go back not that long ago, even 2008 changed this a little bit, but not, I would argue, as dramatically as, from my perspective, the last 12 to 24 months. Before 2008, if you went into General Motors and said, hey, I got a great idea for you, this is a better way to make an instrument panel, they would laugh at you, tell you that you're really not that smart, you're just a supplier, and what gives you the right to come here and tell me how to make my parts? After 2008, they were, and I'm picking on GM, it was all automakers, nothing special about GM. After 2008, there was a little bit of humility that said, yeah, we kind of had a rough patch there, but we're getting better, and we'll tell you a little more politely what we want you to go do. In the last 24 months, we have done projects with just about every automaker where they've said, hey, that idea that you showed us, could we pay you to actually develop that, and then we could maybe get it quicker that way? All of our customers that I deal with, this is probably isn't true of the guy who's purchasing who's calling and saying, I just want it cheaper. All of my customers are saying, I need my organization to change faster. How can I get your technology into my car faster? 25 years, I've never had a customer say, how can we go faster? Now I have every single one of my customers paying me to develop technology that they can get into their car faster. Crazy. Step down, what's YF situation then? So shameless plug, we're unveiling a show vehicle in January, 2 weeks after CES, a signature event, where we're gonna say, well, this is what we think the future of mobility looks like. I couldn't show any pictures because we haven't released it yet. By all means, that truck, it's gonna be on a truck, and so it's mobile. If you work with YF in any way, call Purchasing Scott and say, I want to get inside that truck, and we'll let you inside the truck. We'll show you what our vision of that vehicle is. For sure, there'll be press releases and whatnot. But that is not going to look like a car interior. Historically, for the last several years, even the pictures that I showed are just taking a standard car and saying, well, how can I reconfigure the seats? This is a completely different view on what mobility would look like. Inside of that, the stuff that's in there looks nothing like what it looks like today. So YF has to figure out, how am I going to take all of this capital that I have, hundreds of millions of dollars of capital that I have, and repurpose it to stuff that I don't make today? Am I going to make wooden floors? A little teaser there, we've got a wooden floor. Am I in that business all of a sudden? I think I might be. There is no instrument panel, so the thing that we have up there, are we in that business? What equipment do I need to do that? That flows down then, and the reason I'm bringing it up for you guys then, with the lower volumes that we see coming and demonstrating, and I completely agree with Daron on, there's going to be this high volume platform, but then there's going to be boutique top hats that go on top of that. If everything's less than 10,000 units of volume, do I injection mold stuff at 10,000 units of annual volume? Or do I have silicone molds that I do castings at that kind of volume? I don't know the answer to that. And I guess you guys don't know the answer to that, but you're going to want to figure out the answer to that, because if injection molding isn't the answer for these interiors, you want to get on the tracks of whatever the thing is that's going to supply the 10,000 parts a year. And I don't know what that is, so I would love to have that conversation and continue to have that conversation with you guys over years. But those are the disruptions that we're seeing at the automaker, YF, and then what we see as a tier one.
Great. All right.
A big applause for everybody.
Appreciate it.
So before the team wraps up here, I remember I said earlier, if there's one thing you take away, so I'm just glad there's still going to be promiscuity in an autonomous car.
Nice.
I had to. It was there. It was right there. They teed it up. So seriously, the most important thing I think is that you came today, and hopefully you got something out of it. I did. I know I learned a lot from the crew here. But particularly want to thank the Team One team. I go to a lot of events, and the preparation and the detail and the logistics today, this is about as good as you'll find. So I really, a big round of applause for Brennan and the team. So with that, final comments, guys.
Obviously, this is the first time we've ever done this. I think my feeling today is we might do it again. Not tomorrow, maybe not next year. I know Brenda and our team are very thankful for that. But we would really like to think of doing this sometime in the future. And if you could take a few minutes, there's evaluation cards. We'd appreciate your feedback. And if you have comments, suggestions, anything we can use, we're going to meet as a team over the next couple weeks and digest what we've done well and what to improve on. Because like I said, I think we're going to do this sometime in the future, and we'd love to capture that as we did. So,
With that, I would certainly like to give a big thank you to our panelists, Jeff, Daron, Jeff. Thank you so much.
and
So
we
we're
have
going to shower you with some bling.
We have a bunch of promotional swag, so you're going to be, you can wear a lot of Team One stuff over the next few days. So,
And next, we would like to say a big thank you to Laurie and Glenn, our panel moderator and our master of ceremonies. Okay.
and of course, we'd like to once again thank you, Albion College, Nancy, Chad, Shannon, and the whole team. This is a wonderful facility. We had a great lunch, so thank you for all your hard work. We also have JTV and Rob. We're going to be producing a video, so if you have any interest, we're going to have a full-length video of the whole event and some marketing pieces coming out of this. So again, thank you for all your hard work. And then finally, Gary and I would like to personally thank all our team members who have gone through and given of their time. We've done, as Glenn said, this takes hundreds and hundreds of hours. And I want to particularly thank Brenda Eubank. Oh, there she is. Without her leading us, she makes Gary and I look fabulous. So we thank you so much, and the rest of the team for helping out. So on that note, we do thank you for spending a few hours with us. We hope you feel that you learned one or two things or more, and we really enjoyed seeing the dialogue and the conversation that happened outside of just the presentation. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and have a safe drive home and a great weekend.
Thanks so much.